Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome on the Learn Grasshopper live session. Today, I have amazing guest, Gavin Nicholls, called Aussie BIM Guru. Hello, Gavin. Can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Kris. Thanks for having me on the show. And I've been watching a lot of your webinars for a while and also your progress. And it's really an honor to be able to hang out with you and talk about what we love, which is, I guess, computational design and automation and all those things that keep our industry moving forward. So thanks for having me on the show. And I look forward to going a few rounds in the ring.
Yeah, it's a really honor to have you here on the stage. I've really been following for years, and you set up the standards of knowledge sharing and how you do it in your YouTube channel with your trainings and sharing your knowledge. So thank you for all the support for AEC industry.
You're welcome, and it's great to see you sort of picking up the mantle now as well for Rhino and Grasshopper users. And I would never go on to say that I inspired everyone, but I like to think that I guess I created some precedent for people to go, you know what, I'm going to do that too. And people like before me, like Jeffrey Pinheiro and Nicholas Cattelia of BIM Pure inspired me as well. So it's just this continual sort of movement, I guess. So yeah, it's great to have you in it.
Yeah, and great that you're still continuing now. I really recommend to go to Gavin channel, Aussie BIM Guru, and check out all his development on C#. He's doing incredible good work on that. So for everyone interested in the topic, so go to YouTube channel. Hello, everyone. I see lots of people already waiting, so it's going to be epic fight. We will start in 3-4 minutes, so just prepare a little bit. I can just show, maybe we can also start a little bit for those who just joined. So you can define, maybe just write on the comments, what are your skills? If you can just write Dynamo and the number from 1 or 0, never use Dynamo, to 10. I'm the Dynamo expert as Gavin. Maybe for Gavin, I will give 12 points. And for Grasshopper, the same for 0 until 10. So we can know what kind of scope of people are watching, and we'll see what is the level. So I'm really curious. And just write, instead of just writing the 0, just wrote the letter Dynamo for D and Grasshopper some numbers, so we know the skill. So I'm really happy to have Gavin because he is master in both of them. And when I was looking for this topic, that came to my mind to organize this epic battle, Parametric Fight Club. Gavin was on my first list to reach out. I reached him out maybe already 6 months ago. And I'm really glad that I saved the date because I know that you are really busy. So I really appreciate that you are here. So we have the Dynamo users. Lots of Dynamo users here, 5. We have also some Grasshopper and Dynamo for 6, Dynamo 2, Grasshopper 8, Grasshopper 0, Dynamo 10, Grasshopper 1. Okay. I was thinking that since I'm Grasshopper biased and my community is following also Grasshopper, so I was thinking that there will be majority of Grasshopper users, but I think that also we have lots of Dynamo users here. We have also some users who are just starting, so it's also cool to see. I think this will be the best, I think, if someone just starting from scratch and just where to start and what to choose. So this is something I really appreciate. Harold Martin, nice to see you. Edward, Christy, Remy. And Gavin, what about your community? You have thousands of followers, you have also students. Are you seeing that they are mostly like Dynamo oriented, or you see Grasshopper, or it's like 50-50?
It's definitely more heavily on the Autodesk/Dynamo side. I mean, my channel's always been Revit leaning at the very least. I've covered Rhino inside Revit and some Grasshopper workflows because I think they're really important as well. Even if you are a Revit user, so you have all the tools that you need at your disposal and you know the best one to use at the right time. But I guess I would say probably Dynamo is more likely the types of people I would expect to follow what I'm up to. And these days, probably more likely potentially C# advocates as well. developing Revit add-ins, given that's sort of become my trajectory over time. I saw a good question in there as well from a really good name, Binary Cloud Chaser. But they did say, what is an expert, which is actually a really good question as well. Do you just know all the stuff, or do you just know enough how to code? And I guess in programming, I feel like you can never really quite call someone a true expert unless they've written like literally the code right down to the source, because like you're always learning in programming, right? You learn what you need at the time to get what you need done, or you're learning what you need to be able to build whatever you need. So I never quite feel like I'm a true, fully fledged expert. There's always more things I can learn, more things I can do. Like I would say I'm like Grasshopper 6, Dynamo 8, probably. Like I'm humble too, so maybe that's like part of it. But I know people in Dynamo that can do like infinitely more complicated things than myself, geometrically, for example. And I'll probably pull some examples up later from some of these people I know and respect. But I guess I like to think that generally, like I've got a good grasp of the software, and that's maybe a mild level of expertise where you at least are comfortable doing most things on the program. Maybe that's more what the higher numbers represent in this case.
And we have also imposter syndrome, that you are not feeling that you are good enough. So, but yeah, and I can see lots of great answers, like lots of variety is really different. Dynamo 9, Grasshopper 6, Dynamo 6, Grasshopper 4, Dynamo 6, Grasshopper 0. Good. Great to see your results. I've been promoting this this workshop for quite long, and there was a lot of engagement from people on LinkedIn. Lots of good comments, longing awaited battle, excited for this, it will be fun match. Also, as you mentioned, Nicholas, when is the weight in, expecting this to be dirty fight. We are not going to be go in this direction. We are going to compare these tools. Timo just wrote, is a David versus Goliath. I think our aim is to try to show which software used to which task. We have also supporters. So Eric Fritz, supporter for Gavin. I really like that one. Gavin will bring a real Ru in the corner to hold his towel to intimidate Kris. We have also Martin, maybe more on the Grasshopper side. I have my preferences, but I will not tell you. So lots of fun, and I think this whole workshop will be fun. So let's get started. We are live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And if you will leave a comment and like, I will really appreciate that. So today's webinar, so we will try to keep it in 2 hours. No more than that. We have 10 runs, so I'm going to hold on the clock and count every round. So recording will be available to watch later, but just only for a couple of weeks. Afterwards, I'm going to close that for just community. We'll share Grasshopper and Dynamo scripts. Gavin prepared a lot of good stuff comparing these two tools for the same tasks. So after registration at learngrasshopper.com/Dynamo/Grasshopper, you can scan this code. So you will get all the scripts. And we also prepared the document. So you can go step by step each round. So our thoughts about where to use which tool. And as always, write your questions, comments, and scores. We are really here to also hear your opinions about Dynamo Grasshopper for using the to specific tasks. As I said, Gavin, I'm really honored to have Gavin Nicholls on the stage. I've been following him for years and admire his work. Gavin worked as a senior associate in the, you can call it also national computation lead, and he shared his knowledge on YouTube channel. For those who are seeing Gavin for the first time, I really recommend Aussie BIM Guru channel. He supports architects at the national level and computation and automation lead with particular focus on tools like Revit, Rhino, Python, and C#, and respectively API. So I'm really happy to have you because you have so broad knowledge about Revit and using different tools. I really recommend to go to Gavin website, BIM Guru. He has great trainings for Dynamo. On YouTube, you can also search for Python and C# trainings for really great stuff you can find. And just one thing about that Gavin is using both Dynamo and Grasshopper. I know that he was in all the presentation position in the left corner. So Gavin is not going to represent just Dynamo. So it's not, we are going to talk about both tools. I am more Grasshopper biased. So maybe some of the things like rhinoceros having. So this is something I have my own Grasshopper platform. So I will talk mostly from Grasshopper perspective. I've been using Dynamo for some tasks, but mainly I'm using Grasshopper. For those who are seeing me for the first time, my name is Krzysztof Wojsław. You can just call me Kris. After being structure engineer for 10 years, I have created my own learning platform where my aim is to share knowledge and teach architects and engineers the new ways of working, how to use programming to have more fun at work. Last year, we started with Jung Fu Park. We started a new project called grasshopperinrevit.com, and we have created a free guide for those who are interested. You can go to Grasshopper in Revit to download the guide, and you can check out how to start using Grasshopper in Revit. And Jung Fu Park is an architect with the engineering skills, and for the first time, he was presenting Rhino inside Revit Autodesk University. This year, Autodesk University took place in Nashville, and I was really happy to see that Autodesk allowed to conduct a lab session about Rhino inside Revit. Gavin, what do you think about this perspective? For years, Autodesk was blocking Rhino inside Revit to show Autodesk University. Do you see this is a change in our industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think there's a bit of critical mass going on where it's a bit hard to just put it off to the side and ignore it. I think Rhino Inside has been a really significant program in terms of interoperability, especially for architects. I think it came out almost, what about like 5, 6 years ago now? It's been around for quite a while. But it was pretty much functional from almost the first release, I think. It's been a really dependable program that I think has helped us focus on what each program does best and not have to force one to be the other necessarily. That's where at least Rhino Insights really shone for me. I think it introduced a lot of Revit users to Grasshopper, which is great. But it also made Grasshopper users more aware of the Revit API and probably brought them over to Revit add-in development or some middle ground. So I think it was a really great unification between two groups of users and developers that really weren't actually that far apart in reality, but just needed that bridge. And we've seen other things in the past, like Flux, for example, that they tried to do it and so things didn't quite work out. So it's nice to see this one has stood the test of time. And I will take my hat off to McNeil because really they enabled this. They made Rhino headless, which, as far as I understand, means that Rhino can run within the same memory space of other applications. It doesn't need to launch just on its own. It can launch through other applications, which means it can see everything that's happening in the application. So really, to my understanding, McNeil did a lot of the heavy lifting to enable this, at least initially. But I think they've obviously found many more opportunities through choosing to make their application work in that way. I think there's other things Autodesk is doing, like their data exchange program, where they are trying to sort of create alternatives to Rhino Inside that live just within the Autodesk ecosystem. Personally, I would much prefer to see projects like Rhino Inside really thrive because I just think they have more opportunity available if you don't necessarily want to be 2 feet in one ecosystem. So it gets my backing as my interoperability choice for Rhino and Revit.
Yeah, I really see this difference, and yeah, you cannot just say that Dynamo is the best since they are producer of Autodesk. So really happy to see also McNeil invited for this lab. And for those who would like to start with Grasshopper in Revit, in 2 weeks, we are going to start recruitment for our new project. So you can just scan this code and go to waiting list, and in 2 weeks we are going to start recruitment. So we recommend. All right, so let's go to the topic. I will also change the screen so you can see Gavin is on the left. I'm going to go to the right, but we are going to discuss not stand for one tool. We're going to talk about 2 tools. So just comparing years in the industry, Grasshopper already 18 years. So it's been quite a lot, I think, getting popular in AEC industry in last 10 years specifically. Dynamo for 14 years, but I think he used maybe for 10. I haven't found. First release was 13 years ago, like an alpha version. Users is really hard to compare. I found some internet 1.5 million of users, but it's difficult to say it's Dynamo users who just open once or they are using it daily. But for sure, there is more Dynamo users at the community. So valuation, Autodesk, a huge company, 60 billions. McNeil is privately, stubbornly independent for sure. They've been some propositions from Trimble, Autodesk, or other companies to be bought, but I think their aim is to be independent and privately held. Superpowers for Dynamo, for sure, Revit native data handling. For Grasshopper, which I really like, Grasshopper, that is easy to connect with different softwares, especially in our EAC industry. Weak points, we have Dynamo struggles with really complex geometry. Maybe today Gavin show how to crush Dynamo with so heavy geometry. We'll see. Weak point of Grasshopper is, of course, that it requires additional license, and it's a little much harder to. The entry point is a little bit easier in Dynamo, but we are going to talk about that later. So some assumptions when we talk about Grasshopper. So when we are talking about Grasshopper, we are actually talking about Rhino inside Revit. As Gavin mentioned, Rhino inside Revit came in the last 6 years, but before that we have lots of tools that been using the same system. We have Flux connecting Dynamo, Grasshopper, we have Geometry Gym, we have Speckle, Conveyor, BIM, Revit, all the stuff that you can also connect Grasshopper with Revit. But today we are going to talk about Rhino inside Revit. McNeil put a lot of effort, a lot of money to invest, and I think that they created lots of stuff. Assumptions, I know that already some people just wrote about PyRevit and C# and Dynamo. We are going to talk about Dynamo, pure Dynamo. Of course, we are going to compare programming text-based languages, but in this fight, we are going just to talk about Dynamo. So we are going to go through 10 runs. We have for every single topic. We will go, and I really invite all of you who are with us. We have more than 300 people live, so I'm really happy to have all of you. If you can vote together with us, we have our own voting system, so we can just write for each round. You can just vote. So we are giving minimum 0 points and maximum 2 points for each round. So we can just write on the comments. The syntax is like Dynamo 2, Grasshopper 0, and you can just write and assess in each round. So we can also put your comments on the screen and talk about that. So for the thousands watching around the world, the fight of the century, ladies and gentlemen, for Gdynia in Poland and Adelaida in Australia, let's get ready for the Parametric Fight Club. So let's start with the First round, complex geometry. So Gavin, if you can just share your screen. So let's compare how we can see. This is something like, for sure, Grasshopper is strong, and all the fame of Grasshopper came from this complex geometry, but we are going to compare, also create some Dynamo. So let's get started. We have lots of people. We have, as we discussed on LinkedIn, I am in Canada right now. So we have really lots of people determined to see this live going. All right. So let's get it. Okay, now we can see your screen.
Cool. So I guess before I dive right in, I thought I'd add a few extra points in not necessarily defense of Dynamo, but in clarification. So a lot of people don't realize that a lot of Dynamo is open source. So it in itself helped Autodesk users actually collaborate and share more openly. So whilst it is obviously attached to a software that most people see as quite closed in nature, it really helped open our community up. And my understanding is based on a webinar I saw from Ian Keogh, who originally created Dynamo. I think it was made in response to needing to move data between Rhino and Revit without the need for C# add-ins. So I think it almost emerged sort of like Rhino inside Revit to some degree from similar motivators. So I guess it does have very pure intentions in why it came to be. I thought I'd also clarify, you mentioned there was 1.5 million Dynamo users estimate, and there's less Grasshopper users, but I would defend the Grasshopper community in that I suspect that the depth to which they use the platform and also their understanding of geometric mathematics and more complex concepts is probably on average higher, even if the platform has been around a little bit longer. So I will throw a bone to the Grasshopper community there. The platform almost encourages those types of people to use it, in my experience.
We will have this round for community, so we will talk about
that one. But yeah, I guess I jump in. So I guess comparing geometry is probably not worthwhile. So we decided to compare complex geometries, where we're pushing, I guess, the limits. And honestly, what I determined as complex geometry in Dynamo is not very complex in Grasshopper. So I am going to show some parallel examples where I'm doing almost the same geometric operations, and we'll see pretty quickly that Dynamo can struggle. But I guess we'll get into that. So I guess you can see, like Grasshopper, we're very used to seeing very organic and curvilinear forms that Revit naturally isn't really happy to build unless you put a lot of work into custom components and scripts and add-ins in a lot of cases. So that's just like an example of the type of thing you might see in Grasshopper. This is a project, to my understanding, it's by probably one of the most successful users of Dynamo from a geometric perspective in my experience, Karan Bucky, who undertakes very complex projects in Revit, often with a heavy fabricatability focus. So this particular tower, from what I understand, I think was at least geometrically foundated in Rhino, but Dynamo was still very much capable of acting as a placement routine and a fabrication analysis tool at a very complex scale. And these are the types of things I've never quite pushed geometry to the limits with in Dynamo. So I did want to point out there are definitely people out there that are proving that it's still very much possible to push Dynamo quite hard. I don't know what the processing times are on the scripts, but I can see he is running in automatic mode. So that is pretty brave. So it can't be too bad. So I'm just going to take a very simple city. So a lot of the use cases I use Grasshopper for are to analyze city models and to undertake things like solar analysis, view analysis, the types of studies where you need a fairly large context to understand the quality of your site or your design. So in this case, I've just taken a basic, fairly light context model from just a website that produces these. And I think it's called CAD Mapper, if I remember correctly. And this isn't even anywhere near the complexity of context model we would use in a professional setting because the buildings aren't very accurate. But we'll see that Dynamo will struggle in some regards with this. So we can see already, if I just ask this object for its geometry, it's going to start to throw certain types of errors at me, where, to my understanding, the geometry engine under the hood is unable to convert certain types of objects, and generally this will just lead to a warning and a failure to create the object's geometry. So this can already cause problems when you're trying to deal with these types of objects, which is why we generally probably wouldn't use Revit for this type of thing. Whereas in Grasshopper, yes, there'll be some errors, some warnings. I think that's only because I selected some curves and I'm just using a clean tree, mesh join, not a problem, runs almost instantly. And I will show this in the script as well shortly. So I'll just boot up Revit and Dynamo just first of all to show, I guess, what this might look like to a Dynamo user. So I think I need Revit 2026. Yep, there we go. So I've just got a model. I've put it into a family. This is generally best practice when you're dealing with a context model in my experience. So if I ask this for its geometry, it's going to have to give all the geometry to me. So if I boot up Dynamo, which is just currently sitting in the background, I'm currently running in manual mode, which is probably an important clarification for anyone that hasn't used Dynamo before. So Grasshopper, generally, unless you put in gates and dams and mechanisms to slow down your script and get it to wait for you, it will just try to run like all the time in principle, in my experience. Whereas Dynamo does have automatic and manual mode, also periodic, but we won't touch on that one. And this is a little bit safer when you don't want your script to run while you're working. And often it's how I end up using Dynamo. Now, in this case, I've already assigned a few things. I've picked a park, and I've told the park to get divided into a bunch of panels that I can test for solar analysis. Now, in this case, I have consumed vectors from outside of Revit just to make my life easier. I did get these vectors from Grasshopper and Ladybug, funnily enough. So you can get the sun direction in Revit, but it involves some pretty complex Revit API and some hacks as well. So I have already sort of conceded that Grasshopper's already helped me in this round. But you can see that it ran like a little bit slow there, right? Like there was a delay. It was probably about 3 seconds or so to divide this into tiles and run a ray bounce on the context. Now I'm using a special type of ray bounce in the Revit API, ray bounce by origin direction. Behind the scenes, this doesn't actually require you to provide any intersectional geometry to Dynamo directly. If I asked for all the solids in this model, it would just crash. It will crash. And I'll probably crash it after this just to prove it. Or it's going to be very, very slow and I'll have to crash Revit just to keep moving on. But in this case, we can see that it has successfully run a ray bounce and figured out where the cityscape is being hit by sun rays, so I can determine roughly how much sun on a given day we're getting. Now, I have sampled this very heavily. So in this case, I've actually done a spacing of 10 meters, which for anyone that does analysis will know that's a pretty bad sampling size. That's way too big. But if I bolt this down to 1,000, I'm going to go slower by a factor of at least 10, which I don't want to do in this case because Dynamo will struggle. So on the flip side, I can also just do the same in Grasshopper. In this case, I will be introducing Ladybug tools, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's a fantastic package that does a lot of what I've just had to do in Dynamo manually. So I will concede to Dynamo in this case, that at least in the case of Dynamo, I have had to at least use native nodes for that whole script. This one, I've introduced a dependency or a custom package or an add-in, depending what you call them. So in this case, I think they could call plugins in Grasshopper. But if I jump over to Rhino, so this isn't Rhino inside Revit, this is native context in Rhino. I generally don't run analysis studies through Rhino inside Revit unless I have a reason to. Otherwise, I tend to export and keep it Rhino native where I can. If I unlock this, bang, done. And I put a 10-meter sample on this one just to at least be fair and equivalent, but I can push this pretty hard. I can just go down to 1 meter by 1 meter. And it shouldn't take very long. Done. So you can see that like the speed is already significantly faster. And I have built these nodes or similar nodes in Grasshopper natively before or using Python, and you can get even faster than this if you take out all the other things Ladybug's having to do. You can make this like at least double that speed. And that's not to say Ladybug is slow. Ladybug's doing a lot of things for us. But if you just isolate the few geometric things you need, you can really crank that speed up. So if I go back to Dynamo, I can either do one of two things here. I can put the tile spacing to 1 meter and see how we go. Or I can even just, I think I've already asked for the geometry of these objects and it's already failed. So this is actually asking for that city object to give me its solids. And you can see it's throwing a pretty scary error at us. And another one, same one. So they both failed. So I can't even crash Dynamo that way because it didn't work. To be fair, I'd almost never use Dynamo for something like that. All right, we'll just do this 1000 and run. So you can see the benefit of manual mode there. Even if I make a little mistake, I mean, if I just typed 1 there, I would guarantee crash. But like, at least I have a chance to catch myself. Whereas in Grasshopper, you have to be a bit more careful when making those types of changes.
Yeah, that we have a good comment, because on Grasshopper we have this log solver, and there's lots of usage on that, especially in Rhino inside, that people are working just with log solver and just pushing the changes when everything is done.
Yes. Yeah, there's lots of ways to limit, I guess, the flow in Rhino for sure. Even just like stream filters, there's lots of mechanisms you can use natively in the script. But definitely not saying Rhino has to run automatically all the time. I totally appreciate there's many ways to run Grasshopper in Rhino. But you can see it's still going. So I don't even know if I can compare the time between the two, because I don't know when it's going to finish. And we don't want to be here for the whole 2 hours just watching that spinning wheel, right? So
but this was the point for just showing and comparing. Yeah, and we have it already.
So I've got another script that I know will finish in both cases that we can use for a true comparison of speed. This one's just a basic attractor, a single point attractor, very simple computational algorithm. And this is sort of the second example, so that we at least can get like a relatively fair, predictable runtime between two. So you can see here I'm just doing a fairly simple script. This is sort of like your computational design graduate's first Grasshopper script. If it's not a twisted tower, it's a single point attractor, right? I'll just make a new Rhino model just so we don't have any geometry to worry about.
And we are going to share the scripts that Gavin is showing, both for Dynamo and Grasshopper. So tomorrow I'm going to send the email with all the materials presented today.
Yeah, so we have pretty much the exact same algorithm running. And I don't know if we'll be able to fit them both on the screen at the same time. Probably not. But let's say we've got, like a grid count of say 15 by 15. And I've got a MD slider here, and it's pretty quick. Like, it's not quite instantaneous, but it's pretty quick. And the way that I'm generating these solids probably isn't necessarily the most optimal way in Grasshopper, but it's the way that I've chosen to do in Dynamo, which is extrude as solid. So you could definitely make this faster if you built it in a way that Grasshopper enables. But for now, you can see it's relatively fluid. So I go over to Dynamo. I'm in automatic mode, which means we're pretty much always running. And I make sure I'm doing the same sampling, 15 by 15. You can see immediately we don't have an MD slider, which is already a bit of a weakness, but we'll talk about user interface a bit later. So I start dragging this. You can already feel there's definitely chug there. Like, it's still keeping up but you can see that I'm definitely ahead of the slider. And worth noting that this is not just doing the U and the V value at the same time. These are separate sliders. So the other one is processing, I guess, a UV in a different way, which may also, have computational cost associated with it. Probably not much, but still some. So you can see it still can keep up. It's not like it can't do geometry. It just depends on the scenario. And I know, Kris, you said we're not going to say it depends, but I guess this is my first it depends. There will be a few. So I guess they were two examples I put together to just show that, Dynamo won't always just crash and die, like some people say, but it does, have limitations that you can hit pretty fast if you're not careful.
Yeah, and you have to be careful and while producing. So that's why we haven't scored Dynamo 0 here, because you can produce. It's slower, but still you can produce stuff.
Yeah, it's very hard to give any of these criteria 0. I think because there are still people working really hard on these programs that are very passionate about them, and to give anything 0 is basically to say you may as well not have bothered, which I think is like a really harsh assessment to make of any software developer, because at the end of the day, we're all here trying to make this industry work. So I forget if we have any 0s in here. We have a couple of 0.5s, I think, just out of respect for the fact there are product managers and people working on these programs, and I don't want to invalidate their work. But I guess before we move on, or maybe Kris, you might have some comments as well. I just was going to show some basic examples of the fact that you can introduce Dynamo into some scenarios in Revit. So we had some projects where we were dealing with like fluted facade panels, and we had to modify the families to punch window openings through them. And users would have to have went to each of these and modified parameters to actually collate this void in amidst all these families. It's actually built into each of those blades as a separate thing. So we used Dynamo at least to influence and find those heights. And we also used it to offset the bases to follow a raked roof profile that it couldn't naturally do as a loadable family. We used it to assess, I guess, a high-level framing design for a project to do a high-level quantity takeoff, and this actually ran quite quick. And then we do often introduce adaptive components, which we'll talk about later as well, I imagine, especially with Rhino inside. Sometimes we can use Dynamo to place these as well as just Rhino inside. Whereas on the flip side, I guess we often find geometry and Grasshopper very quick and easy to work with. It's very versatile. You can do a lot of things with geometry. These are actually fairly basic examples. Some of the more complex things I'm probably not allowed to show just because they're quite bespoke and probably identify projects quite clearly. But we do things like all the time, like, everyone's built their little block stacker at some point. I think Giraffe and all those programs are coming in and validating them now at this point. This was a fun project where we were doing a waveform ceiling that we ultimately did generate adaptive components for in Revit through Rhino Inside afterwards, but we did the ideation stage in Grasshopper. We use it for solving, so we have a desk solver like nearly every big architecture studio out there. There's a lot that are probably way better than mine as well. And then we use it for, distribution of elements around patterns and rails and all sorts of things that Grasshopper, I find naturally is just attuned to handle. But you can push this thing way, way harder. One thing while we're on geometry that I think we should talk about is, there we go, is Grasshopper comes with Kangaroo, which I think is really cool. Dynamo does have a package called DynaShape, which can actually do quite a lot more than I expected when I first saw it. But to me, like we love using Kangaroo as well in Grasshopper. The physics is really interesting, the way you can apply it. In this case, we're just using it for a rough bouncy solver for like space planning and adjacency mapping. So this is a live adjacency matrix running through Python on the side to try and figure out where like the strengths between the departments, and we use it as a very high level schematic tool. We can do weird things with Grasshopper geometry too. This is my attempt at making a Minecraft solver. So we use the plugin called Mouse which figures out where your mouse is on the screen and gives you array. And we used it to intersect a grid, and you could effectively click and build a project as if you're in Minecraft, which was quite fun. And then in real time, it was collating and joining by layer and figuring out departmental areas and volumes as you went, which was pretty cool. But I think in both programs, it's all about being smart with the type of geometry that you use. So this is an excavation algorithm that we were playing with not too long ago. And a lot of people would think by default you should do like a solid intersection and carve out the volume from the site. Whereas I realized you can just break your surface up into a point grid and shoot rays, and you know that the area represented by the face of that point, assuming it's pretty equally distributed, times the length of the ray is pretty much a volumetric calculation within some degree of tolerance of the angle you hit the site at. So we figured out that was like a really fast way to just estimate excavation in both Dynamo and Grasshopper fairly quickly. So I think that's
this is really, I really like that you brought this up, because sometimes like messing up with meshes and make a difference between solids, and sometimes this kind of approximation, let's say it will be maybe roughly like 5%. Nobody cares about the excavation in this one, but you can calculate this really quick in the quick way.
Yeah, and the important part is we needed to run it through a generative solver to find optimal siting locations for these profiles, so that ultimately I think we wouldn't have just been able to run it in the way we wanted to. So I really enjoy challenging the types of geometries that are appropriate for certain scenarios and trying to find the most simple versions you can to get away with what you need the answer to. Or finding smarter ways to set up geometry. So like in Grasshopper, a classic technique I like to use, and even in Dynamo, is if you've got a very complex shape and you want to have lots of them, you only need to build one and then distribute it with an orient node at the end, and just orient them onto the planes that they need to sit on, instead of putting everything at a point, modifying all of them, and just killing your session. So, but I think that was pretty much it. I mean, I like some tools. I like the mapping tools in Grasshopper. I know Dynamo is just starting to explore graph mappers, but I find graph mapping, surface mapping, all sorts of techniques in Grasshopper are fantastic. So I think, to me, I'm very comfortable saying that, Grasshopper is a home run geometrically for me. It's not even a concession. It's just it's an admittance that is just part of what I use it for. And yeah, I'm happy to give Grasshopper a pretty good score based on that basis for that round. Yeah.
Yeah, so we pretty agree on that one, that Grasshopper wins. So we have 2 points for Grasshopper and 1 for Dynamo. As we said, you still can do stuff there. Maybe not that fast as Grasshopper, but still is possible. Just write your comments. What are your assesses? Maybe we can answer one of the questions. And I think maybe when it comes to complex shapes, we have Dynamo or Grasshopper for digital fabrication processes. Maybe you have some experience with that one, Gavin.
Yeah, it depends on what you're trying to assess. So if you're trying to like optimize a shape, so like a really common type of algorithm we use is like relaxation, as you call it, where you constantly iterate an algorithm back on itself until you find a stable state that you're trying to reach, say having only 3 types of facade panel sizes, but you've got a complex shape and you need to keep running an algorithm against itself, like, I hate to say it, but like a Voronoi, using something like Lloyd's algorithm, for example, very basic example, not generally what we use, but a very easy example to understand that concept. Then Grasshopper is fantastic for that. Dynamo for me is often handy when you're trying to assess a geometric measurement or condition and report it in a schedule to a contractor. So if you have like a panel with a double curvature, like a 9-point panel, and you want to know edge lengths and deviations and how far from the front to the back of the panel in depth is that going to be, so they know they can actually fit this thing into like a routable space, then you can definitely do that in Dynamo relatively comfortably, as long as the geometry of the object is fairly efficiently managed. And that's where adaptive components I find are fantastic, because you can get the control points and the control curves of adaptive components and avoid collecting like the more complex geometry that they sort of hold together. So I think it depends on what you want to do. Again, it depends. I've said it again. Whoops. But in this case, I think that there's definitely use cases for both. Yeah.
Yeah. I think when it comes to complex geometry, community agree, 1 to Dynamo, Grasshopper 2. Some of them just gave 0 to Dynamo, but pretty similar results. Okay, let's go to the second one, where I think we have first one to Grasshopper, so maybe we go to second one, which is Revit data handling, and we both know that here Dynamo is really strong.
Yeah. So I see my screen share. Great.
Yes.
So yeah, in this case, I guess I found this whole space of our industry through Dynamo. So I like Christoph, like you have a sweet spot for Grasshopper because it's what you found, it's what you know, it's what you love. Dynamo definitely does hold that sweet spot for me when it comes to data processing. Like we will show that Rhino Inside is capable of generally everything Dynamo is from a data processing perspective, but I think it comes ready to do a lot more, which makes a huge difference. So we'll definitely talk about that too, and how much customization each requires to sort of work. So in this case, yeah, naturally, you've got a Revit model, you've got data inside objects, it's ready to go. Rhino, interestingly enough, can sort of behave like a BIM model. You just have to add attributes to objects and actually create that data-rich model. And we actually do that at work sometimes. Sometimes we will recreate parts of our BIM model in Rhino with baked attributes, which is something Rhino Inside is fantastic for. But at the end of the day, I guess a lot of us are stuck in Revit because it's where we're delivering from, generally, we're documenting from, and naturally a lot of those processes are automatable. So to natively do that in the same space is obviously a really strong point. Rhino Inside is fantastic. It's a great tool. It has some really interesting user interface choices in how they've chosen to, I guess, associate parts of the Revit API back down to how you interact with it in a visual aspect. So the collector process, which we'll show, is quite different in Rhino Inside, and I think it's actually a really great bridge into the Revit API, because you learn about filtered element collectors through building them out of nodes, which is a bit different to Dynamo, where they sort of try to handle a lot of that for you. So just a really basic example, I guess, quite a boring one, but usually boring is simple and simple is easy to demonstrate. It's just to take all the sheets in a Revit model, filter out anything that can't be edited, and that's going to require a custom node, which I'll talk about very briefly, and just make their properties uppercase. Now, this isn't really something we usually do in a project. Usually you probably just named it properly in the first place, but it's just to show in principle what Dynamo does in case people haven't actually seen it like in action before. And now it's sort of on its home turf. It's a bit more comfortable in what it's going to be doing. So we're not going to crash it with geometry. I am going to open up the most boring house in the world. Everyone knows this project. The little house. Sorry, Sam McAllister, but we appreciate it at its time. So in this case, if I go down to data handling Dynamo, uppercase parameter values, generally there's still going to be a canvas there, but we're not really going to see anything on it because we're not dealing with any geometry. So in this case, I'm collecting all the sheets in the model, getting their parameter value of sheet, converting it to upper, checking if it's different, also checking if the element can be edited. So we will talk about like customization later, but what this is a custom node. So I already am like sort of cheating a little bit here by adding something custom into the equation. But this is to show that I guess if you want to build scalable tools, you're going to have to think about more things than probably what a lot of Dynamo tutorials out there show you. I'm trying to boot up the Python engine. This can sometimes take just about 10, 15 seconds when it first loads Python 3 in. It'd be funny if it actually crashes here. That'd be quite amusing. There we go. So I am accessing the Revit API and dealing with something that Dynamo doesn't offer out of the box by default, which is checking if I can actually edit an element before I edit it. So a lot of scripts people build don't do that. So you just end up getting can't edit elements because someone owns it and your script gets cancelled. Rhino inside, same thing. Anyway, so I know it's editable. I know it needs to change. This is one of my favorite nodes in Dynamo. It's pretty much a list dispatch from Grasshopper. In principle, you have a mask and a list of objects. And for the Dynamo users, that's what filter by Boolean mask is equivalently in Grasshopper. And then finally, I just set the parameter value by name, which I'm pulling back all the way from here. Now, we're going to talk about user interface, but you can already see this is a bit of a weakness of Dynamo. Like there's no hidden wires, which I sort of miss sometimes just to show that is actually happening here. So scripts can get a little bit messy. And then finally, I'm just counting the changes. And I think I might have prepped this for Dynamo Player as well, which we'll talk about later. So we have an output, we have an input, we have an input. There we go, cool. But if I just hit run, you can see in this case, I don't think it had to make any changes. It might have booted up on a different model. In fact, I think it might have actually, yeah, okay, it ran on this model, I'm pretty sure. Just to make sure. That is one thing Dynamo does usually focus down on a model. No, I think I'm actually on the wrong model. So you do have to boot up a Dynamo script from the model. Dynamo is not pointing at the current document. Which one is it? Hopefully not this one. Oh, yeah, that's why. This model has no sheets in it, so I'm just going to close it. There we go. We're at the sad house again. Okay, that's a pretty bad UX, isn't it? I'm just going to boot Dynamo up again. So that can actually throw a lot of people off in Dynamo. What you saw just there is it wasn't happy because it wasn't pointing at a document, which is always a bit annoying. Rhino and Grasshopper, you have the benefit that you can only have one model open at once. So Grasshopper generally knows what it's focusing on, whereas Dynamo does add that complexity because Revit can have multiple models open at the same time. So this should just work now. There we go. So we can see I've uppercased 6 sheets and done. But I can do the same thing in Rhino inside as well. And it's really not too different of a workflow. So in principle, it's the same thing. We're going to get the same outcome. We're going to use very similar nodes. We're going to need to use Rhino inside. So yes, that's a dependency. I've added some gates so that I tell the data when to write itself. And there's probably better ways to do this based on user comments, but that's generally the technique I use. In this case, it's not really, I might be corrected here, and I hope I am, but like I don't think there's a very broad range of custom packages that target Rhino inside at this point. So if I needed like a node or a function that filters out elements that aren't editable, I'm not sure where I'd get that in the Grasshopper community right now, but I hope to be corrected. Like definitely correct me on that one. And then from there, I guess the transaction is always going to be the thing that mostly takes the longest when you're dealing with Revit. So the speed isn't going to be that different in all honesty. Like if you had 5,000 sheets, you'd probably see roughly the same delay in processing because you're always dealing with Revit at the end of the day, and that's going to be the slow part. So if I just get that model open again and I undo that transaction. For anyone that hasn't ever used Rhino inside, you install it like a typical Revit add-in, and from there you just start it up, and Rhino's now in Revit's memory space. It's up on its face doing its thing. And then you boot up Rhino inside Revit. It doesn't really graphically tell you that it's inside Revit, but that's what it's doing. And then in this case, you just boot up Grasshopper in Rhino in Revit, which to me is still amazing. Like I still get amazed every time I do that. That's just so seamless and fluid and just works. Like that's a complicated thing to have set up behind the scenes, I'm sure. So I definitely respect the work Neil put into that to make that such an easy process. So you've got different types of UIs here, like pickers and filters and all sorts of things. So this is sort of like the way that I guess you would filter down to what you want to interact with. Whereas in Revit, we're going to look at user interfaces in a little bit. But you can see I'm getting all the sheets. And in this case, I'm filtering instead. I'm using a class filter, which gets all the elements. So I'm constructing the collection method in a way that's more similar to the Revit API behind the scenes, which I appreciate. From there, we can get all the parameters of the first sheet and find the one that we want, which in this case is sheet name. And then we get the value we currently have, we uppercase it. And in this case, I'm not like checking for editability. So if I was in a work shared model, this might fail. But again, we don't have that node natively available to do this. Having said that, Rhino Insight does have a lot of nodes. I just don't think it had one for this particular check. But I just hit the button and we can see it's just undertaken a transaction in Revit as well. And it's worked. So we've achieved the same outcome, but I guess to get to Rhino Insight and Grasshopper, it's a different process for a user. Like if I was a Revit user and I've never used Rhino, I would be really scared going through like 3 windows just to get to my script. So I do sympathize to people that haven't kept up, I guess, with this technology, but that is like probably the main drawback, I guess. And to me, it's not a major drawback. It's just the nature of what you're trying to do.
And you have to get used to it, right? And you have to get used to that.
Yeah, definitely. And I've definitely found you can freeze out Rhino Insight occasionally. It's not like you can't do it consistently, but occasionally it seems like Rhino Insight can trip over transactions and lose context of itself in memory. I think the community is aware of it. There's been some threads about it before and they're working on it. But you can lock out Grasshopper in Rhino Insight very occasionally when you run transactions, where all you can do is zoom in and out. And you have to basically close down Revit, reopen Revit, reboot Rhino, reboot Grasshopper. So when you run Rhino Insight, that's the only instance of Rhino you get for that Revit session. You can't like reset it. So if something goes wrong in that Rhino session, like that's it. You've got to sort of restart your model and restart Revit. But it's pretty rare, but I have come across it. So this is a different sort of workflow. So adding revisions to multiple sheets. I'm using a couple of extra custom nodes. I think I'm in automatic mode, so I'm definitely going to want to not be in automatic mode. It's probably going to just get confused because there's no sheets in my selection at the moment. It's probably booting up the Python engine again, which, as you can see, does take quite a bit of time. Unfortunately, they did have to switch to CPython 3 as the Python engine in Dynamo and Revit 2023. I think they officiated it and made it the only option. And I think Rhino 8's got some similar challenges right now in dealing with CPython 3. So we shared the same challenge in that space, unfortunately. All right, I'll just try that again, but this time I'm actually going to just show the initiation for that process. So this script is sort of made to work through, I guess, Dynamo Player, but what I'm going to need to do is just select some sheets first before the automatic mode kicks in. I can probably say manual and just reopen it and hit manual when I want to, but the idea here is I'm trying to add some user experience to the script by saying that it only works on sheets the user has selected when the script is ran. And then it's, I think, just a slightly different routine. I have a drop down where I can pick revisions. There's only one in the model, whether I want to add or remove it. Now, these are custom nodes again. So I'm sort of cheating here again. I'm using some custom nodes that don't exist in some versions of Dynamo. But this is really built to run through Dynamo Player. So I think in this case, it's already ran, I think, because it was in automatic mode. But it should have added a revision. Yep, there we go, to all of those sheets. And the cool thing about regardless whether you're in Dynamo or Rhino Insight, is these processes are generally scalable. If it's 5 sheets, if it's 5,000 sheets, it doesn't matter. It just takes a bit longer to run, but these are all scalable tasks. So if you're looking for ideas of things to automate in Revit, you might have some ideas come off the back of this. These are quite boring tasks. They're just very, necessary things that we have to do. But if I go into Rhino Insight, I've got pretty much the same. And I think they actually had a node for it that I just clustered. Oh no, I wrote some Python. Okay. So this is sort of, I guess, when I use a custom node in Dynamo, you can do the same thing, but use Python as well to access the API natively, which we'll talk about Python in more depth. But I guess what I've done here is actually created a Python cluster, or a Python node in a cluster, and you can directly reference the Revit API. Once you've got this, you can pretty much do like 99% of what Dynamo can do as well, because Dynamo is really just tapping into this as well for the most part. Except for its own native geometry engine and things that it has that aren't Revit based.
And,
But you can see otherwise,
compare Grasshopper and Dynamo, it's pretty straightforward and the same, right? There is no limitation of possibilities of accessing Revit API.
not that I've found so far. You just have to sort of anticipate control flow. That's probably the main difference in how you initiate these nodes sometimes. I mean, my preference, it's a bit of a dumb one. I just use triggers like buttons that only run once and then they stop running after that using an if statement. Whereas Dynamo does have that benefit of just naturally being in that state by default. But if I hit run, it should have already happened, but I think it's already processed. And we can see we got the same outcome through Rhino inside, but using Python, I guess, as an additional. And I guess the last thing I was going to show is that there is a decent amount of user interface available in Dynamo for scripts that I think like puts it a little bit above Rhino inside without a fair degree of customization. So there's obviously Dynamo Player, which I think we'll talk about later in more depth. But we also have a custom package that I think is fairly easy to work with compared to some of the alternatives in Grasshopper. Probably Swimple's pretty good. We'll talk about Swimple. But like comparing it to Human, like my experience with Human, like great package, really cool, super flexible, but your user interface nodes end up actually becoming more than your script in the end in really complex workflows in my experience. Whereas this one is just 4 nodes and some tuning settings. So it boots up something a little bit like this. Now this is using a Windows form. Ooh, yuck, Windows forms. But I guess whereas I think Human uses WPF, which is a bit nicer. So it does have limitations, but it lets you provide more selection and interaction to the user. And that can also be booted up through Dynamo Player, which we'll talk about later as well. Whereas I guess in Grasshopper, you'd have different dependencies. I think more of them exist than when I was using Grasshopper and building UIs at the time, because I mostly used Human. So it's probably left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth having to build really big interfaces through it.
We're going to talk about that in the last round about user interface.
Yeah. But yeah, just to finish off there, I guess the packageability we'll talk about later. But yeah, Dynamo Player we'll show later on. But I think the scripts do end up being a little bit simpler sometimes for the user to understand, especially if you have to use a lot of Python. That can sometimes make it harder for a user to understand what's happening unless you're really clean and label everything clearly at the surface level, or you're good with clusters and make sure that the logic of the script is obvious. But yeah, like I said, Rhino can hold attributes and process data and behave like what you might expect a BIM platform does. I think we've already spoken about that. Yeah, so I guess I'll let you sort of establish your thoughts and yeah.
We are giving in this round, I think, fully deserved 2 points to Dynamo. I saw some comment, let me see, that is not fair to compare data handling between Dynamo since it is native to Grasshopper, but this is the point of this fight, that we are going to compare that. We have some comments about that from Guru. How do you think manipulating view filters in Revit using Grasshopper can be flexible?
It depends. It depends on how you're constructing the view filters. Do they already exist? I actually prefer to use temporary view templates as a means of distributing filters to views to create temporary states. So you put the filters you want onto a view template, you turn everything off except for the filters as the property that's applied, and you disable the view filter that's locked on the current view. And that can sometimes be easier to engage with. But if you have to dynamically construct view filters on the fly, which can be done, and add them in a specific order and remove them when you're done, that can be a bit messy. You could do a temporary view override. I think they call it the temporary view properties mode, where you're able to do things and then discard them when you close the mode. But it is a complex piece of code to write there. I guess that would be the only concession, regardless of whether you're in Dynamo or Grasshopper. It's a pretty custom system you're talking about there, but totally possible. Yeah.
Why not compare the ability to manage large data flows instead? I think there is not that big difference. So what is your opinion about that? Do you see that when it comes to speed?
Yeah, I guess it's hard because the types of data that people tend to flow through the programs tends to be quite different. So I guess you got to remember in Grasshopper, you're generally not passing through an object with probably the same degree of complexity as in a BIM model, because you're generally passing an object through memory that has a lot of properties, a lot of methods that can do things to the object, expose its own geometry. Whereas when you're passing through a solid or a surface or something like that in Grasshopper, it's probably a much simpler object to flow on. We'll talk about data structures in a bit as well, like trees versus lists. And I think that definitely has an impact on what data flows work better in which scenarios. I mean, if you were sending like only text in a workflow from Excel in Dynamo or Grasshopper, I don't think you'd see a huge difference in speed. Like Dynamo is very fast when dealing with like strings and integers and doubles, and they're quite close to, the fact that it's written mostly in C# under the hood, and it's relatively quick. And I think Grasshopper similarly, I think it hinges on C# behind the scenes. So you wouldn't expect a huge difference in, I guess, using those types of more raw data types. I guess Grasshopper, naturally, the scripts end up growing and growing and growing because you end up doing a lot of like transformations to geometry and things, whereas Dynamo is often a very linear process. It's sort of like I start here, do some stuff, and then I finally finish by doing something. So they're different types of programs, I think, in how they get used. So large data flows are actually often a bad sign in Dynamo that someone's probably like overcomplicated something. Like most Dynamo scripts that I see on LinkedIn, for example, they have like the same branch over and over again in a big row, and it's like that should have been list levels. Like it should have just been handled through a more complex data structure versus splitting it all apart, doing the same thing on 8 branches or sublists. So there's a lot of factors to think about there, but hopefully that sort of answers why we haven't spoken about that.
Yeah. So after 2 runs, we have a draw, free. So I think like community also agrees on that. Let's go to the next one, and we have user interface. And maybe I will just start with Dynamo, which I do not like in Dynamo. This preview of the whole idea back is amazing, but I think it's not quite working well in Dynamo. I really like in Grasshopper that you have the separate programs for graphic and for script. So it's kind of, idea is great to have it like in the same window, but I think it's in Dynamo, it's not been created in the good way. Is it possible to switch off this preview? How do you manage that with the complex geometry, Gavin?
Yeah, you can turn off previews by a node at a time, but you don't have like selection only or something like that. One of those more customized preview modes, which I use a lot in complex Grasshopper scripts. So I totally understand where you're coming from there. I mean, Dynamo's goals with the user interface are probably quite different to Grasshopper's. Like Grasshopper began and always knew itself to be a designer-orientated platform. So I think to do that, you have to like appeal to designers and actually, respect a lot of laws of user interfaces and UXs that maybe Dynamo had the opportunity to not necessarily worry about straight away. And I guess the things that Dynamo puts in its interface are quite different. They're things like, like a package manager, because, dependency is going to be a much more common thing that you're dealing with custom packages. It's got a lot of Revitisms built into it. The way that it sort of works is obviously like Autodesk built and inspired, at least the Revit flavor of Dynamo is. But yeah, I can definitely talk about more of the interface as we go. But I might just maybe quickly show Dynamo's interface and what sort of things you can see in it and expect in it. So I might actually just boot up Dynamo itself. Now I am in Dynamo for Revit 2023 here. I think that does mean we do have like the dark node modes. So immediately, like obviously the nodes are on the left versus on the top. I'm not always the biggest fan of that. Nodes are similar in principle. Inputs, outputs, wires. There's various like, shift controls and things very similar to Grasshopper. I mean, a lot of this was inspired by Grasshopper, I'm sure, because the developer of Dynamo originally was using Grasshopper, as far as I know, as well. So it's it's flattering imitation for the most part, because they're like, if it isn't broken, why reinvent it? There's not like, I can't right click and flatten the output of this thing. Like I miss having those things when I'm in Dynamo, because I love
like
the ability
a quick interface, quick access to the interface, like most used functions.
But also the leanness of it as well. You can keep things very lean, icons mode. There's a lot of like, really nice things that I think Grasshopper nails. In case you can't tell, I'm going to give this round to Grasshopper.
You can always change your assessment, Gavin.
I mean, I love Grasshopper's interface, so I definitely am not good. Like, I wish I could hold down Alt and click on this thing and it finds it in the browser. I love that feature in Grasshopper. But you can see like things that I guess Grasshopper doesn't focus on as much. Like we have a workspace references thing here, which is like Sort of something that was added, I think in 2023 actually, and it tells you like, okay, you have to go and figure out you've got the wrong version of packages. So like when you compare this to like Food for Rhino, it's a very different experience. Like, I mean, I know they're reworking Food for Rhino at the moment. I hate Food for Rhino. Like every time I have to interact with it, it just feels like I'm on some website from like the 90s or something. And I know they're reworking it, so like it's not a dig. But like, you know, I would take this and, you know, the package manager interface over like Food any day. I guess from there, like a lot of people complain about the search in Dynamo, and they're right. It's not great. If I want to get the geometry of an element, I look up geometry and I get like U, V, X, Y, Z. Like, what the hell? I don't want any of that stuff. And geometry doesn't even show up as a word once. Like, pretty stupid, right? And that's because they all come back to a geometry namespace in the library. So I have to be very specific. So I'm like, well, I want the element geometry. Oh, where is it? Didn't get it. I have to actually put a dot between, and basically spell out the node for Dynamo, like almost letter for letter to find it, which is, and then even when you see it, it's not called element geometry. So you're like, I assume I've got the right one. So like the search is definitely something that's been heavily criticized throughout Dynamo's lifetime. There are packages that exist that try to deal with this. One really popular one is called Monocle, where they added in a simple search that just works much more like how you'd expect a search to work. I know they're constantly saying they're going to rework the search, and I think they've actually changed it a few times to be even better. But as you can see, I still really struggled to get to a very core node there through searching. I think if you go through the library, you might have more luck. No, still the same rubbish. So that's not great. But I guess once you do know where a node is, you can just go to it and it takes you to it. So that's sort of like holding down Alt in Grasshopper and it pointing, here it is. Like that's sort of like the equivalent. But you can see I still had to go up and, you know, get back to it in the browser. So it's not the most intuitive, human-friendly thing. There's various extensions that you can do. You can add like documentation to your script, like icons and descriptions. I think actually that's a different extension, graph properties. That's what I'm looking for. So you can add like a bit of a front page to your script for Dynamo Player, which is nice. So you can definitely make it a nice experience for the user. You know, there's various, you know, typical menus you'd expect to see, like help and view properties. One thing that's a bit hostile in Dynamo is geometry scaling. So you do generally have to, in most cases, tell your script to focus on more large-scale projects, which is like most projects. So that throws a lot of people off. The nodes will tell you, like, you've done something wrong here. You probably need to be an extra large. I assume behind the scenes that's because they're dealing with different like sizes of or like bytes available for types of integers or longs or doubles or floats, and some are more approximate. That's my guess, but I could be wrong. So don't quote me on that. If I get like a warning or an error, that's custom node, so that won't give me an error. Like generally you get like warnings and errors and feedback. You get like learn more if you want to learn exactly what this thing's trying to tell you. That was added more recently, I think in 2023. So it is pretty nice if you're a beginner and you're just trying to figure out what the heck's going on, because you're going to see errors and warnings for days. But as you can see, as I navigated around, there's definitely quirks and things that maybe aren't quite as nice as Grasshopper. So maybe, Kris, I don't know if you wanted to show Grasshopper and sort of compare your take on the interface.
I can show. Dylan just wrote that watch to the 3D nodes in Dynamo can come in handy to preview selected geometry without overloading. I think it's a good one.
Yeah, that definitely helps. Cool. Yeah, that's right. I was going to make a cube, but I guess you get the idea. You plug it in and it gives you a little viewer of the geometry you provide it rather than showing it in Canvas. But if I can just get a cuboid by length, there we go. Okay, no, I don't want that. I just want the cuboid. Then I'll watch 3D. Sorry, there we go. So you get like a little mini canvas in principle that like is like hosted inside your script and doesn't force you to interact with everything all at once on the canvas. So I guess that's sort of like an isolated preview, sort of like what we were talking about before, where you just do selection only. I guess you could take a watch 3D node around your script and just plug it in to a preview you want to see at a certain point. Because otherwise you can like preview nodes, you can freeze them, which is like disabling in Grasshopper. Very similar. You can override the name. These are things we're pretty familiar with. You can create groups and you can create notes, which is sort of like Grasshopper scribble, I guess, as you call it. Before we move on, I guess like maybe you might want to show some of the shorthand tricks in Grasshopper, because I think they're really cool from an interface perspective. But Dynamo does have a few tricks as well. So if I double click, that's sort of like, you know, doing the panel with that. And you can do various shortcuts, like there's syntax shortcuts in code block format. This is sort of like a function editor. if you might call it that. I think it's called the function editor in Grasshopper, where you can create like mini functions in situ. But I can say, I want to range from 1 to 5 with a step of 1, and it's like I know what you're doing. So there's a lot of shortcuts in here. And you can also take nodes and turn them into node to code if you want to write in like a design script format instead. So there's still quite a lot going on there from a UI UX perspective, but it's very different to, I think, the motives of Grasshopper's UI UX. But I'll hand it
I can a little bit show the Grasshopper. I think like when we compare like search. So every time when you just double click, I think it's working really great. I think because it's searching for the names. Actually, sometimes it's even searching for the rhymes. I don't know if it's a Git Git developed. But what I really like in Grasshopper when it comes to searching, that is alias. For example, if you have list length or you have some components that you're using over and over again, for example, if you use list item, just writing L and I, and it will come as a first one. I think it's really powerful, especially if you are just using, so it's really cool. This window, like this is suggestion. I think it could be better in Grasshopper. The idea was great to like you can just take it from the left side and Grasshopper tell you which one to use. Maybe it further will be developed. But what I really like in Grasshopper is also icons. I'm fan of icons, but for those who are not preferring icons, you can change it to text. If you would like to have text and icons, so there is a bunch of components that you can use and just show both of them. And also, I think strength of Grasshopper is that you can just have split to the two different windows, so you can just operate one have just for geometry and one for the from the canvas. And of course, like there's a bunch of tips and tricks as you showed with the Dynamo. So there's the same things with Grasshopper. So you can set sliders. Actually, David Rutten put a lot of hidden Easter eggs. So there's lots of fun even after using Grasshopper for 10 years, exploring and discovering new things. I don't know, do you have still find something new in Dynamo as well?
I mean, I guess for Dynamo, I don't use it as frequently these days. So often it's like, oh, that's what they've added. Like it's more like new things that I get to see in different versions. I guess that's usually what catches me by surprise. You were talking about the suggestions window. I think it's called the Markov chain in Grasshopper.
Yeah.
Normally, there's an autocomplete nodes tool that's been sort of subtly introduced over the last couple of versions, and I'm pleased to see it's definitely getting better at figuring out logical steps. It's definitely like getting close to like the way the Grasshopper one feels, maybe even slightly more intuitive, which definitely is like a lot nicer than searching constantly for nodes. So that was probably one thing that I guess caught me off guard. I was also going to mention too, you mentioned icons. And I guess this is one to Grasshopper beginners. Don't get too comfortable using text because the forums all use icons. That's like a really big tip I give people, because eventually you're going to need to use the forums, and most people will not tell you what each node is like by name. So it's a good habit to get into, to start recognizing those icons. But I must say, given how many nodes Grasshopper has, it's amazing how memorable those icons are. Like I generally can recognize them now, and there's like hundreds of them. Whereas in Dynamo, I generally can't identify the icons very well. I mean, I don't see them on the canvas, so I'm not used to seeing them. They're only in the library, but they've done a really good job graphically in Grasshopper, I think, with giving it a really distinctive character, look and feel, and like they've definitely built it with designers in mind, which comes across very, very much so.
So in this one, we pretty agree that Grasshopper has better user interface. You can also write your comments, but let's speed up to the next round, which I think is really important because we have lists versus trees. So let's jump. Maybe there is lots of people new to Grasshopper, so maybe I can just introduce quickly what are trees. So we can see that trees are the lists inside the list. So in Grasshopper, we have new terms as branches. So every list has own lists, and we call it branches. We have paths, so we have the numbers, and It's really powerful. I can show you some examples. And as in Dynamo, we have items and we have indices. And what is really important to understand in Grasshopper, that we have different levels of data trees. So we have the first level, we have the second tree level, and we have the next ones. And all these zeros that you can see for beginners are really hard to understand. And I get it. It took me some years to understand data trees. I've been struggling a lot. I think every single Grasshopper user struggles with data trees at the start, and I pretty understand, because it's a hard concept about understanding. But I always showing to grasp the idea of data trees in Grasshopper. I always showing this example, how the data is stored in Grasshopper. So I always compare that to the folder structure. So it's working in the kind of same way, but our items are placed in the last branch. So for example, if you are looking for the element, let's say letter A in this data tree, so we have to open the folder which is called 0, first level. We go to the second level where we have 0 and 0. Then we have 0, 0, 0. And there we have all the elements. So we have this kind of folder structure as we have in Windows or Mac. So you can search for the results and you are finding your item. The same with the second one is 1 semicolon 2 semicolon 0. So this is the folder name. And then we are searching for our item. And it's really helpful. It's really hard to understand and start it. The entry level is really high, but when you get it, it's much more easier to manage complicated manipulation data. And I can just show this example. When you are transferring some data, for example, for SAP 2000 here through Grasshopper with Rhino inside, so you can have as a one node just divided to columns, to beams, and make all the data manipulation. It's much more faster. So if you go through this entry level, so data trees are really helpful when it comes to speed, but also readability. And I list out some advantages of using Grasshopper data trees. So first, we have this structure hierarchy with addresses. So all these zeros are not necessary. This is something that we really need. And it's really, if you're working in the AEC industry, it's really can be associated with the floors, grids, points. So you don't lose where it comes from. The second one is we have lots of native tools as a graften, flatten, simplify, path mapper, and also available just with the one click when you would like to flatten and graften. And when you get the idea, it's really easy to manage. And the performance. So everything is compiled in the C#, so there's lots of speed in the data trees. However, we have some disadvantages. As I said, steep learning curve. The path syntax, you really need some time to understand. Even advanced users still has a problem. Debugging can be really difficult. From my experience, or teaching Grasshopper in many of my trainings, the 90% of Grasshopper problems coming with the data trees. It's always, maybe it's mesh in some kind of cases and some of BRAPs which are not closed, but 90% are coming with the data manipulation and data trees. And compared to Dynamo, list levels, maybe you can say it more, Gavin, about that, but it's more explicit, and especially if you work with Python and C# or also connecting that with Tekla or Revit, it's much more easier. So what are your thoughts about, maybe you can also share some of your thoughts, Gavin, about lists in Grasshopper?
Yeah, I can share an example.
List in Dynamo.
I mean, you can do lists in Grasshopper technically in Python, I guess, so they do exist as a concept. Just you have to pivot to them. So I guess, like trees for me, they're like necessarily complex, right? Like they're there to foster complex geometry structures and necessary very deep trees sometimes, like 5-6 levels deep in data structure. Generally in Dynamo, my rule of thumb is if you're dealing with anything beyond like 3 levels, you've probably overcomplicated your workflow. Like very commonly on the forums, we'll see these things and there'll be like a 2 deep list and then a 3 deep list, and we're like, whoa, why do you have like inconsistent data structure? Something's wrong there. So like lists usually are great because they're simple, but it's because they're usually tackling more simple, regular, parallel sort of structures of information. Before I jump into Dynamo, it's worth pointing out that lists, trees, all of these structures computationally are actually just hiding a much more complicated system behind the scenes from us. My understanding is that in C or in like very low level or like less abstract computing, lists are built out of what's called a struct, which is a piece of data and 2 things above and below it called pointers that say either go here or go here if you're going forwards or backwards if you're in a list. Whereas in trees, they support a different sort of structure using a similar concept. So when you're searching through a list, sometimes it's going to be better to use a list and sometimes it's going to be better to use a tree, depending on how you're working your way through that data structure behind the scenes. So that's always going to have a big difference in when trees shine and when lists shine. I don't know if like there's too many scenarios where lists are like better than trees. I assume just because the Revit API is naturally working with lists, it makes sense to be working equivocally. That's probably just going to have benefits.
And most of the software outside, so I think there's no software that works with trees, right? When you're going to export to
I mean, there's definitely branches of computing that work with trees, and there's like similar concepts to trees. Like hash tables aren't too different to like the logic of what a tree is trying to do. It's trying to create the shortest possible way to get to an object without having to go through the entire list to search for things. Or there's all sorts of I'm sure use cases outside of AEC for trees in computation. But I guess I'll just share my screen.
Sure.
So I think it should be coming up now. You've
got, we are seeing Dynamo.
Yeah, great. So in this case, I guess I've just built like a round trip. So I'm getting all the sheets in a model. I'll just make sure I'm in an okay model. Oh God, I'm in the house. So in this case, we've got sheet number, sheet name, and I'm just going to freeze this for now. So if I run this node, to begin with, we have a list of items. So we can see we have level 1, level 2. So as you work your way further to the top of the list structure, you get higher in level. So at level 1, I have items. Level 2, I have a list. And you can have lists of lists of lists of lists. That can get deeper and deeper and deeper until you have like very complex data structures. But Dynamo generally will let you work across list levels in parallel, as long as the types of things you're doing don't intersect it with other types of list structures. So you can see I still have the same data structure in lists when I pass it through. And Grasshopper is similar. The tree structure remains relatively preserved unless you do something like simplify or flatten or manipulate the list, the tree structure. You can also just combine lists in parallel. So you can see I've got 2 lists of the same shape and I'm saying add the number to a tab, to a name, because I'm going to send this out as a TSV string. So in this case, I'm just joining them. And I've got something that looks a bit like that. And the reason I've chosen this list is it's a 2D matrix in principle. So it's a very comfortable sort of structure that you're probably already familiar with, even if you've never used Dynamo or Grasshopper. Like that's a matrix in 2 directions, columns and rows. So you could look at this like 2 lists, or you could look at it like a list, a list, a list, a list, a list, a list, a list. So you can pivot in both programs between those shapes, and it's called usually transposing or flipping the matrix. So we can work, if you have a very clean, regular data structure, you can do a lot of things with it. So Dynamo generally is going to expect you're probably working with some pretty well-structured data. And if you're not, you've probably done something wrong along the way most often. So
if I can add something for Grasshopper, if you are making more complicated data tree structure with more depth, non-regular, no symmetric, so actually you cannot flip. So this is also like you have to remember that this transpositioning is not always working.
It's probably worth also adding for newer Grasshopper users. To begin with, you're probably going to find yourself using flatten, simplify those nodes quite a lot, because you'll get into like scary data structures you don't like and you want to just flatten them all back down and make it nice and friendly again. But really, yeah, as Fabio's pointing out here, you usually shouldn't be using these functions very much. Unless you're in a rush and you're doing a very quick operation that it benefits. It's usually better to keep your tree structure intact so that you can scale with different input trees to begin the process in the first place, because it can work across different tree structures in the same way algorithmically. So yeah, Fabio, great point, and literally good timing as well. Literally the same point. So and I used flatten and simplify a lot when I first started using Grasshopper, and then I watched Andrew Human. He had a really good masterclass on trees, and I think the first thing he said is he's like, stop flattening, stop simplifying.
Yeah. And also Val said David Rutten data tree masterclass was an eye-opening for me as well, but after I think I have to watch it 5 times to fully understand.
Yeah.
And this is something we are also using in our scores, comparing Dynamo Grasshopper, that I really like that in Dynamo is much easier. This entry level is easier, and it's really important in industry to start with something simple. And this is why we are also giving points for Dynamo here, because it's simple.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think we might be tying this round just because it's like it depends on what you're using these structures for. Like one doesn't necessarily beat the other. It depends on what you're doing. Again, it depends. We can keep saying you're right. But I guess I've just added extra information in Excel here, and I've added like an approved design, checked, drawn, and a sorting parameter just to put them in an order that I feel like. And I'm intentionally naming these the same as Revit parameters, because what I'm going to do is introduce a more complex list execution. So I'm going to actually introduce list levels. And for each of these sheets, I'm going to set all of these parameters without needing to declare each of these parameters by name each time for each value. We're going to use list levels to really simplify that operation. And this is like the classic list levels demonstration. Like you'll usually be best off using this to explain list levels to a user in Revit. So I've got this file, and I'm just probably going to freeze the last node so it doesn't run. And we might just have a short delay for the Python engine. No, that's okay. So I've got my sheets. Now I wonder if I ran this in the wrong. I might have run this in the wrong sample file. I think I expected to run this in the Snowden Towers model accidentally. I didn't expect Revit 2026 to crash so early. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a bit of a hack. I'm just going to go and create these sheet numbers on the side, and just modify my Excel file just to create a different set of keys to match to this data. So I'm just going to go back to my Excel. Now, this isn't cheating. This is just because I'm in the different model to what I expected. So I'm just going to paste those instead. I'm just going to get rid of this. And these are sheets that will exist in the Revit model by number. So I can definitely line these up. So I'm just going to close the script. I think I could have reran it, but I'm just playing it safe. So I should still have this node frozen. Yep. Okay, so now we should have 2D lists. So we can see here we have lists of rows, or the items are the items in the row, and the lists are effectively arranged around that. So in this case, I can use special types of list construction and deconstruction nodes. So deconstruct literally just takes the first object and gives you the rest. It's basically just like item at index 0 and the rest, but it's just a nice node to break your headers out. So now I can proceed on with the headers, and I can also proceed on with the list of lists of the data itself. I can then run a rest of items in this case to say that I don't actually need sheet number, because sheet number is going to be my lookup key. The rest of it is data I want to set. Now I'm introducing list levels at this point. So I'm just going to use a watch node to really show what I'm working with, because you see the full preview, which is a bit confusing. So I've got a list of lists, and this is at level 3. The lists occur as items, and in them are items, but I want to work at level 2. So what I'm saying here is for each thing at level 2, deconstruct it. And what I get as a result is I get basically the result of deconstructing each of those lists instead. Otherwise, I would get the first list and the rest of the list, which I don't want. I actually want to manipulate each list. So that would be like sort of working across branches in Grasshopper, sort of like grafting a little bit. Not quite, it's not quite the same thing, but like it's that sort of idea that you're working across. And you can see now I've broken out the sheet numbers from the first object of each of those lists. So I've already implemented the levels here. Now, at the moment, you'll see there's this auto thing. This is what we call the lacing or the replication guide. This tells the data how far it should go if it runs out of data to work with. So if you have like 2 things interacting and you have 1 thing and you have 10 things, shortest lacing means only 1 thing will happen because you've only got 1 in 1 input. Longest means you'll get 10, but it uses the 1 object for all 10. And cross product means it will create every combination possible between those lists. So in this case, let's keep going. So I'm using another list combination here. So I'm saying for each sheet number in the model, find the index of the sheet number in Revit. So I know that these sheets occur at 134025, and I can use this to index the original sheet list to get the sheet that is represented in Excel by that sheet number. And now this is lined up to the Excel data. So this is like pretty much the final step. And whoa, that's like a pretty complicated one, right? 3 levels at once. So I'm saying in this case, for each element, for each list of parameters, which I got back here from my headers. So for each of those parameters, or a list of parameters, I should say there, and for each list of values, set those values to those parameters for that element. So we're effectively just doing something. Now, okay, of course I get an error. What did I do? No parameter found by that name. So I've picked a parameter that doesn't exist in this particular model. Again, because it's Snowden Towers, I think it's going to be one of the by parameters, but I think the rest would have set. Yeah, there we go. We got app 3, check draw. Oh, it's a sort parameters. Sort parameters not here. That's fine. But we can see the rest all successfully set for each of those sheets. And instead of needing like one branch per object, we've just managed to bring it all together and converge those data structures into one output using less levels and using a longest lacing guide as well, which I don't think is necessary here, but I've just included it just in case. I often turn on longest lacing just out of paranoia to make sure it doesn't just do one element. But that's
we have just one question. I don't see any difference between trees and lists of lists. They seem to work the same way. Like the concept is the same, but in the difference that in Grasshopper you can make it more complicated. Like you have more deeper, in the sense that as I showed you, you have these levels, and you don't have these levels of data in Dynamo. Any bigger differences, Gavin?
I mean, I guess like they are on paper. If you drew a tree and you drew a list, you would end up with something that looks exactly the same. But the types of operations that you apply to trees and what's happening behind the scenes and how they work together. I mean, at least when I use Grasshopper, it feels sort of like inverted. It's like you tend to work across branches, or you tend to work through branches. Where in Dynamo, you tend to work through lists. That's the most common way you'll deal with data. As I found that trees, generally they just I guess more flexible when it comes to trying to manipulate them. Like probably the path mapper is probably the best example I can think of. Like when you flatten trees to certain degrees like that's generally a bit harder to do with lists. And I think just again computationally, I think that trees definitely are more beneficial when you're dealing with geometric data structures. I think that's also just behind the scenes probably why trees were probably nominated as the data structures that most things hinge upon.
And this is the points we gave to Grasshopper, but we gave minus points for this complicity, and we gave the plus point for Dynamo for its simplicity. So I think it was a really deserved draw. Of course, if you are going to more advanced stuff, so then you use data trees, but we know that sometimes you have to just use something for really quick, and most of the users use Dynamo or Grasshopper for small things, so that's why we go for the draw. Okay, let's go to the next one. I think, pretty agree. Some people gave to Grasshopper 2 points, but I think it's mostly because advanced users. So yeah, and you can see that some people have been fluttering all the times, but now they understand that is more important. Okay, let's go to the round number 5, custom components, and this is something we can go really quick because we have the similar possibilities in Grasshopper and Dynamo. So maybe I can start package manager, build in Grasshopper similar way. You can create user objects based on your script. The same when it comes to custom package anatomy. So we have C#, we have Python. We have, as you mentioned, we have some challenges with the Python 3 in the latest, but I hope that all the challenges will be resolved in Rhino 9. So when we compare this, maybe you can also share your slides, but I think it's kind of similar in Dynamo, the building custom packages.
Oh yeah, you'd like me to elaborate on Dynamo?
Yeah, if you have to add something more, I don't know if we are going to use that.
I can show, I guess, just what a custom package is behind the scenes, just to see that it's not like super complex when you break it down. So I guess like to me, like custom nodes feel, to me at least in Grasshopper, like clustering to some degree. But yeah, you've got like a Python thing on your screen at the moment, is it? The one you want.
Let me see. I'm showing my screen, so I can just switch it if you.
So I guess yeah, like Dynamo is a little bit different. I mean, I think you have a native package manager in Rhino 8 now. That's been a nice addition. Whereas in Rhino 7, I think you had to just deal with the Food for Rhino download, install, consume package into Rhino workflow. And I must say, I really don't like that Rhino gobbles up the package and gets rid of the file. It's very cute, but it's really annoying when you're trying to deploy software and hope that someone doesn't use the one on the server. So McNeil, please get rid of that cute little feature. It's a nice idea, but just totally impractical. So I guess like the problem with packages and Dynamos, they're a little bit too easy to create. So we do end up with a lot of really rubbishy packages. Like I'm trying to find Rhythm, which is a really good package, and unfortunately I found like all these packages that are probably like either using Rhythm or like they're just like, I love Rhythm, so I made a package. So I find pretty much all those packages. There we go. So you can usually spot a good package in the Dynamo package manager because it's going to have a lot of stars or thumbs ups or whatever system the version of Revit's using. So there are filtering mechanisms to just get to the good stuff. But I guess I've built my own package called Crumple. I think someone did question earlier, am I Gavin Crump or Gavin Nicholls? I'm like, yeah, I've changed my name, but I was Gavin Crump, so that's the Crump part.
Yeah.
It gives you the ability to break things down pretty well. You can, break things into trees and make them pretty searchable. I put a copyright symbol in front of all my nodes, so it like makes it really easy on Canvas to understand that's what the package is. So that if someone sees it in a screenshot, they know to just call me. So generally, you'll have two types of custom nodes. One is what we call a zero-touch node, which means that it's going to call on some C# in the background, and you won't be able to jump into that C#. It's already been compiled into its package. A lot of package managers actually make their packages completely open source. So a great example, which I mentioned before, is Rhythm for Dynamo. So John Pearson has always kept his package out in the open, which is really cool. So you can see the full anatomy of custom packages. You can learn from it, which is really cool. You can see right down to the CS file and everything it's doing behind the scenes, but you can't see that in Dynamo. This one is a Python-based node. So this one's a bit different. This is a custom node. This one doesn't actually use Python. This one just uses design script. But you can see that like a cluster in Grasshopper, you're just burying nodes inside something more complex. So you can see you've got inputs and outputs just like Grasshopper's clustering function. But you can use Python in a lot of nodes. So for example, if I go back to my sheet collector, collect sheets. If I go into the node, I can see I've got a block of Python in there. And I'm able to do things like reference the Revit API and various parts of the API more selectively. I can take in inputs, run a process, and then distribute the output back to the node. One limitation of custom components I don't like in Dynamo, which is always frustrating, is that you're limited to one output. So if you do have more than one output you want to send out of your node, you are going to have to use indexing to split them apart before you send them back out. It's just a small thing, but I think it's worth pointing out that there is a little bit more flexibility in input-output label and tuning. But behind the scenes, this thing can be bundled up and distributed through the package manager. So I do have like my package. I downloaded it, and it just contains a whole bunch of DYF definitions, which to my understanding, I think are pretty much JSON in nature. I think they're just a derivation of like a JSON-ish structure that sort of points all the parts of it together. I mean, you're not going to read that and modify that natively, but it is technically all open in principle. This is all sort of pointing to things you can go and trace back. But otherwise, it's pretty standard. You've got a package file that tells the package how to put itself together, I think, and there's all the other packages I've installed. And that's I guess more or less it from a custom perspective. But it definitely gets the job done, in my experience. Yeah.
We gave one-to-one. There was a good question from Fabio. Is Grasshopper? Is there any difference about speed between clusters and Grasshopper components and Python and C# components? Actually, we made test and comparison once about doing things in C# and Python, and it really depends if you are using which version of Python and what task. For example, if you download some packages for Python, so it can be sometimes faster than C#. Usually C# can, in compiled C# can be faster. So it's really, maybe I will repeat the same as Gavin, it depends. But when it comes to clusters, between clusters and components, clusters are much, much slower. This is something really for sure. All right, let's go to maybe just rate for what do you think, community, just rate for some notes. But in this one, we think it's a draw between Grasshopper and Dynamo. We don't have a winner here. Next one is round number 6, community and ecosystem. As we talked, Grasshopper is much older. So we have Food for Rhino, we have great community. Forum been changed from Grasshopper to Rhino some years ago, but here I will give point for Grasshopper when it comes to how many industries are used for Grasshopper. So as you can see here for AAC, architecture, engineering, construction, at the top right now, but Grasshopper was not aimed to be Rhino, to be software for AAC industry. Actually, it was for boat and marine industry, but you have aircraft, you have sculpturing, you have civil engineering, dental, finite element analysis, footwear, which is really popular, furniture, games, graphics, industry, jewelry. It's a really big market for Grasshopper. Landscape, marine, which I mentioned, which Rhino actually was made for mechanical, medical, huge industry as well. Multimedia. Actually, one of my students joined from Walt Disney last month, so it's really also nice to see that they are using Grasshopper and Rhino there. Twitter, virtual reality, prototyping, structure engineering, a lot. So when we compare, of course, I am Grasshopper biased, and what I'm seeing on LinkedIn is hackathons for like Blocks Hub or AAC Tech, which are using Grasshopper, which are using Rhino Compute. But I will add just one thing for Dynamo here. And I think someone already mentioned that there is for map design. So Dynamo is really strong. Actually, for Grasshopper, there are just few people who are using, and Dynamo is much more popular for Revit. And I think I will give plus for Dynamo here.
Sure.
Maybe your feed on LinkedIn is more filled with hackathons for Dynamo, Gavin.
I see plenty for Grasshopper. I mean, like Grasshopper, like you said, it has been around a little bit longer. I think it naturally collects, like you said, a much more diverse background of people, both from a disciplinary background, but also from an educational background. So you'll get, like, I find a lot more computer scientists and mathematicians in Grasshopper, at least people more inclined towards mathematical geometry because of the capabilities of the platform, which I think naturally creates more use cases for those extensions. And, it's a very flexible tool, and it's a very general tool. And so is Rhino, right? Like Rhino itself is quite broad in how you can use it, even if Grasshopper's not there. So I think that naturally creates a really buzzing community. Dynamo's got, I think, probably a more structured community, because I guess it has less walks of people in terms of why they use it or how they came to it. So someone did point out, yes, you can run Dynamo through Civil 3D. Historically, I think you can run it through Robot and a few other programs. I don't think that some of those flavors live on. Dynamo at its core is, from what I understand, completely open source. So that part lives on as much as you want it to in principle. Like, it's always out in the open, and anyone can pick up Dynamo and plug it into any platform they want in principle. I think there's like licensing agreements and all sorts of things that come with that. But I guess in principle, like Revit was probably the platform that I guess most made it known as of how it can be applied. There's some fantastic people in the community. The forums are quite active. They're pretty civilized forums as well. I think Grasshopper's got a much more diverse range of people from I guess, a way of thinking, which I think creates much more room for debate and also for disagreement. And sometimes people see that as a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I enjoy the Grasshopper forums. I think it's really interesting to see how people challenge each other to be better. But I know that sometimes it can be quite confronting if you're not used to, I guess, that type of environment. Whereas Dynamo is quite it's quite beginning orientated, the forums. Like there's a lot of people still coming with their first script and asking for tips. Whereas a lot of the Dynamo developers, you know, are more focused on helping people now versus I guess bringing their own problems to the forums. So they're quite different in nature. There's definitely hackathons with Dynamo. There's a pretty tight-knit community, particularly from my understanding in Europe and in America. Australia, there isn't as strong of a community attached to Dynamo where I live. There's some user groups here and there, but they tend to just evolve into Revit user groups over time, naturally, because so many of Dynamo users tend to be Revit users as well. But I guess, yeah, there's a lot of resources as well, quite a lot of support. So where is it? There we go. So we have like a primer with a good amount of information about Dynamo maintained by the community and the team. And of course, you know, you've got Dynamo on GitHub where you can go and inspect things, and there's a lot of people contributing to Dynamo as well that don't necessarily just work for Autodesk. And the forums themselves are, you know, pretty standard fare for forums, but they're quite navigable. I moderate them and find it really, you know, fun to interact with the community behind the scenes there. But I guess, yeah, they're just different types of communities for different purposes. And I think that Grasshopper naturally creates a more diverse community just because of how it can be applied. Yeah.
And I think we agree on that one, that we have one-to-one draw on that one as well.
It's a bit of a hard one, right? Because, like, you know, Grasshopper has an amazing diverse community. So I want to say it gets a 2 and Dynamo gets a 1, but like I think like both communities do such a good job for what they're trying to achieve. Like neither of them are like hostile to be a part of. Neither of them are, you know, dying. They're both growing constantly. Both have really active developers that are really great for the community outreach. So I would hate to have to fault anything about either community. I think they're just doing such a great job.
I think it's also in Dynamo community, it's easier to ask for the basic stuff. In Dynamo, in Grasshopper, you have more this advanced group that you are intimidated to ask this basic question. But yeah, this is just a perspective. Okay, round number 7, environmental tools. And here we have already some comments that we have the only one winner. I got some from examples from Christian Dine, Danish architect who was working on early stage analysis to investigate the effect of daylight analysis. And you can see here how fast is it, depending on the angle of the louvers for the windows. So by doing this, you can just find the best balance between the levels of the solar shading. And as you already mentioned, Gavin, like Ladybug and Honeybee, all the tools written in Python, by the way, one of the not that many plugins that was written in Python. Most of Grasshopper plugins are written in C#, but they are just amazing. The same using daylight analysis. He did amazing job doing that directly in Revit with the Rhino inside. So the results automatically exported back into Revit. So I think it's really cool way also that you don't have to just work in a Rhino environment, Grasshopper. You can also, with the Rhino inside, put all the results for the rooms and parameters for the solar analysis. I know that you prepared also some examples. You have some experience on your company, so I'm really looking forward to see that one.
I'm not even going to pretend for like more than one slide that we really use Dynamo for sustainable and ESD focused design. Ladybug tools, it kicks ass. Sorry to swear, but it's that good. Like it's industry standard. Like I was justifying it to a council the other day. It is what we use. Like because they were saying, oh, how reliable is this? And I'm like, if you can't rely on this, then there's a lot of bad buildings out there. Like if we got the results wrong, there's a lot of towers out there that got the results wrong. So like you have like Forma. Honestly, I haven't been able to get excited about Forma yet. It feels like a dumbing down of things that we do better already, at least from an ESD perspective. It does have wind analysis, which is interesting because CFD is very complicated. But if CFD takes less than like a few hours to run, I always question if it's accurate, because I know CFD is computationally heavy and should take a long time to run most of the time if you're doing it right. But yeah, we use Ladybug all the time. This is just like an example of how we just divide, you know, wonky shapes up into something more testable to get an idea of, you know, unit distribution and likelihood of solar compliance. That's like the bread and butter use case for Ladybug tools. It's probably the most boring everyday thing that everyone uses it for, but like it's like the one that most people start with. And I wouldn't go to any other tool for that sort of thing. It has other types of abstract tools like view roses, view analysis, building isovists. That's another like pretty basic use case that lots of people find quite early in it. We do it for radiation analysis. This is a project where we wanted to understand the heat load on certain types of glass and certain room types. And it doesn't even sweat, like it's fine. It utilizes a lot of open source libraries and components that can be trusted as well, like Radiance. So there's a really good amount of faith in how it's being done. It's not like a black box, like a lot of Autodesk's programs tend to feel like when you run them, like Insight. You know what it's doing, what it's using, how it's working, and it gives you heaps of feedback on how it's doing it as well. And it's in Python, so you can always check behind the scenes what it's doing. Daylight studies, this was just a void in a project where we just needed to understand the penetrative nature of daylight in a few levels just to justify the presence of a void, and yeah, it didn't take long to set up. The type of study you showed before, we call it like a shoebox study, where you create like a small test room and you put like a facade type on it, and you can just turn the sun around the building and get an idea of every aspect's behavior, like either generatively or just, you know, drag a slider and write the results to CSV, and it's like, it's just super easy to use. Glare analysis, we've done a little bit of glare analysis. It does have a pretty interesting way of doing it where it can implement, I think, a rendering module from one of its dependencies, which was surprising to me. So you can get at some pretty strange use cases that are actually really useful. But of course, you know, you do have to make a lot of guidance. This is like an example of a script guide for us on our scripts that we've tried to make easy enough for someone to run without really needing to know too much about Grasshopper. It involves a lot of geometry processing nodes to make sure that if they throw something really weird at like the context for this thing, it like cleans it up or at least captures some bad scenarios that shouldn't happen. And we can do pretty complex things with it. So in Sydney, where I used to live, they have a solar standard, and a lot of people oversimplify the criteria because it's just so complex to prove. And I actually figured out computationally you can prove it. So you have to prove that 70% of the living rooms or private open spaces / balconies achieve at least 2 hours. That's easy enough to do. People use a heat map to show it, but that's wrong because technically the guidance for measuring sunlight, it's only one guidance, so you can work around it, is that you have to track if at least 1 meter squared of sunlight measured 1 meter above the floor is achieved for at least 15 minutes. So if you have 13 minutes of that, you kick it out, it didn't happen. So we literally built an algorithm and used MetaHopper in Grasshopper to continuously run this pretty intensive script on a many basis around the building and distribute the results out to a CSV file, which we can consume into an Excel report. So like it's industry standard. I'm not even going to pretend it's not. It's just, I think, I don't think I had too much else I was going to show other than that, but my hat off to the Ladybug team. I mean, without Ladybug, maybe it's a different story. But like, yeah, they've done a really good job.
Yeah, I think it was generous from Gavin's side to give half point to Dynamo.
I will the Insight team.
But as you can see,
I should point out, Insight isn't a part of Dynamo, so I can't even count it. Form is not a part of Dynamo. I can't count it. The only thing I'm counting here is that the Dynamo team attempted to create some solar analysis routines using voxels in 3D, which to a Grasshopper user probably sounds pretty crazy as an approach for solar analysis, but it was their workaround for not dealing with, I guess, the complexities that other types of analyses would probably not have generated in Dynamo. But so that's like literally the 0.5. It's a generous offering.
Yeah. We have clear winner. Like before, we haven't got a clear winner, so now we have it. And now let's talk about cross software integration. As we talked, Grasshopper community and users are more open, using more software than just Revit. I have prepared the list of the connections with the analysis tool for the structure analysis, also for BIM integration. You can connect it to not just Revit, but you can connect it to Tekla, to Archicad, to Quadri, to BreezeCAD. So there are lots of openness, and you are not just limited to Autodesk ecosystem. The same with the visualization software. There are live link to Twinmotion, Unreal Engine, so there are lots of stuff. And actually, every single month there is coming a new connection, and there is a live connection. Tekla connection to Grasshopper is a great, and Grasshopper can be used as a single source of truth. So this is what I really like, that there are more and more projects, architects creating scripts in, let's say for the stadium, for the building, in Grasshopper, send it to Revit with Rhino inside, and they are sharing with structure engineers just a Grasshopper script. And I think this is open new possibilities that you can reuse some of the work. You don't have to build separate model for analysis, separate model for BIM, separate model for solar analysis. You can take it as a single source of truth. So I think this is a clear winner for me. However, what I really like in Dynamo, which is missing in Grasshopper, is a civil 3D connection. I know there's lots of, I'm a bridge designer, so there's lots of projects, infrastructure projects conducted in Autodesk Civil, and this is a point from my side to Dynamo that you can use. There is no live link as far as I know between Grasshopper and Civil. Maybe you, Gavin, know, but I'm not sure if there's existing. For sure, there are some still companies that do not have connection with Grasshopper because they have own ones, like Bentley. They have generative components, so they are still stubbornly not opening the APIs for Grasshopper, but we'll see.
Yeah, pretty much agree. Like, I mean, yes, they've got the Civil 3D support, Revit support, and historically a few other types. They're working on a Forma connection, but the one thing in common is that they're working within one ecosystem, which is like a huge drawback, obviously, for an industry with many more moving parts than just, you know, Autodesk users. You know, we have fabricators that have probably never touched an Autodesk program in their life. You know, Tekla users, for example, they probably have never opened an RVT and probably never have to. So I'm taking a few hits here, so I'll take this one as well. I admit, even like my favorite, you know, connection to Revit beyond Dynamo is Rhino inside, just because of the stuff that it enables. Whereas I guess like the Civil 3D connection doesn't do much for me because I don't use it. Whereas like I guess if I was like a Grasshopper user more regularly, there's probably more programs I'd plug it into that it supports. So I guess from an architectural perspective, like it also probably has more versatility and capability, even if like, you know, there's a few Autodesk products we could potentially, you know, relate it to. We'll have to see what happens with the Forma connection. Like that could go quite far depending on where they take Forma. But at the moment, I guess like it's still in what it feels more like a beta sort of stage. I don't know if it is formally in beta anymore, but it definitely felt like it was still developing the last time I tried it out. But yeah, I just put on screen like my favorite example from Rhino inside that I did like when I first started, where I managed to beam in like all the Revit rooms or surfaces with all their data and push it back. And again, it's not a Dynamo use case. It's just I guess my hat off to Rhino inside again.
So yeah, it's a clear winner, but we gave some points for Dynamo for the integration with Civil and some formats. Let's jump to round number 9, generative design, and Grasshopper is really known for that, especially thanks to these 3 amazing plugins. Galapagos, which is natively in Grasshopper, so you don't have to install anything. You have Galapagos already. Wolsey and Octopus are also free plugins to download. I'm not going to explain much of the whole engine, but on the left side you can see the parameters or genes as it's showed, so you can control. So Octopus or other software can control all these different parts of your models and test it for the different values. So computer just move all the sliders. In the middle you have this parametric model, and you can make all this magic happens with the analysis, and you save the results. So you can have these objectives and constraints, so as your solution. And on the right side, we have the engine that will compare all the results. And some from my training, some really simple examples about here connecting 2 points on the rectangular, which create the line which will cross the most of the circles. Really simple examples, but they show the principles that actually one by one, the Grasshopper will search for the solutions and just save it and go for the next one. Save it, go to the next one, and it can go do it for thousands of iteration. I really like also to show these examples of the foundation when we have constant force, normal force for the foundation. We have some parameters for the concrete, price for the concrete and price for the steel, also CO2 equivalent for concrete and steel. And you can compare what is the most optimal solution, and you can optimize by price, by CO2 emission, building costs, and at the end choose your the winner solution. I know, Gavin, that you also prepared some of cool stuff that you've been working, so you can share. So for me here, Grasshopper, I've seen most of the Grasshopper, but I really also want to see Dynamo in this field.
Yeah, so funny one, that one. So I guess like Dynamo introduced a generative design tool into Revit that Dynamo scripts run through in Revit 2021. Now, funnily enough, this is going to be interesting if anyone from Autodesk is watching. So I'm in the Autodesk developer network where you get access to Revit for the sake of developing things, doing promotions, things like that. Funnily enough, generative design is a separate product, and I forgot that. So I don't actually have a licensed version available to show at the moment. So that's actually a bit of a drawback from generative design, because Grasshopper, it's built in, ready to go. So I'm actually going to say, I think that's pretty poor from Autodesk's front. But anyway, this is, I guess, a Dynamo script that's set up with geometry in place to run a study with various controls to move a building around a site. This is an incredibly simple study. It's just been simplified so I can show a comparison in Rhino Inside. This is sort of one of those like problems where the answer is probably quite obvious, which is, how can I get the tower with the best view aspects in this neighborhood? And the answer is going to be obvious, where it's like, go to one of the corners and make the tower really tall, because that's where you're going to get the most open space. But I can't run it because I can't license the generative design tool. So I'm going to show instead the Rhino Inside take on this. But in principle, it has a very similar interface. I think I've got an image of the interface at least. Before I jump on to the interface too, I want to point out generative design is complex in architecture. I think in engineering, Karamba, generative design, there's some really natural use cases that emerge quite obviously for engineers. In architecture, it can take a lot of time to set up a robust generative design routine that is warranted and can suit a project's budget. So we do try to build like scalable tools that can be used generatively elsewhere. But it really does take those large special projects to really, I think, warrant the implementation of generative algorithms, unless they're a scalable or repeatable use case, in which case a lot of the time the answers may be relatively obvious because you've seen the same problem before, it's scalable, that the answer may be obvious. Not always. And some firms out there definitely push like generative design pretty hard from a scalable perspective. So that's what the generative design tool looks like if you pay for it. Even if you've paid for Revit, you still got to pay, I think, for generative design as well, or get the AEC collection. As you can tell, I'm not happy about that. But in this case, it's sort of like Wallisai. From my understanding, I think it's using a spar algorithm, or it's an NGSA2. I forget which one they implement. But it's very similar in logic. You have like clampers where you can clamp down on options that meet certain criteria from a multi-objective perspective. You can generate variables to send out as results, and you have an options field to pick from and sort and cull down to, and finally instate it back into Revit if it's something that creates a Revit element ultimately. But I guess, yeah, we'll look at Rhino Inside instead, because this one just works because I have paid for a Rhino license. I'm just currently using Rhino 7 because I have Rhino 8 at work. But my business has Rhino 7 just because I haven't actually consulted in Rhino for a while. So I think this is just vanilla Rhino. I need to actually go into Rhino Inside. So I've just got basically the same model. Goodbye, Dynamo. And I'm just going to boot up Rhino Inside, which is already here, and just open up a generative design script that's been built for this scenario. I don't need bifocals, that's fine. So in principle, I guess, yeah, like you show, generative design generally works in a few ways. With Galapagos, usually you have a gene pool with various sliders that you can randomize. The limitation with Galapagos being that it's single objective, so you're only going to be able to measure fitness in one way, ultimately. So in this case, I'm just saying how many good views do I get? That's my fitness. You can build formulas that sort of create a fitness using many variables. You can also cull fitness. If you just exceed a certain thing you don't like, you can just say make the fitness 0 based on a formula to sort of just get rid of invalid options. Like if my building was outside my site boundary. So there's a lot of things you learn over time in generative design. But you can see, like, as I change this, my tower proportion changes. I can move it around in the X and the Y aspects. And ultimately, you end up with this node. This is just one solver. There's like Wallisai and other ones that are way more complicated, but they take more time to set up. So I'm measuring a fitness. In this case, how many good views did I get? And I can visualize it. So that's effectively what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the opposite of this. I'm saying, okay, when do I actually get good sight lines? These are all the ones that are obstructed, and these are all the ones that make it through. So I'm sort of measuring how many times that happens in this site. And that would be quite slow in Dynamo to run. But in this case, like, it doesn't have any problems. There's various ways you can test. You can minimize or maximize the fitness as your goal. You can say like how much you want the population to fluctuate and change and how it evolves over time. So you can make it that it never really stabilizes. It just keeps going and you end up with a big field of options. Or you can say like, I want you to like settle into a certain range of values that worked well for you historically. Hence why it's called Galapagos. So I'm going to show every genome, start from slider setup, and off it goes. Now, I think in this case, it started from a pretty stable state, but you can see it's like, eventually finds its way towards a pretty decent option. You can see it's starting to pick the corners and starting to figure out, okay, it's working best when I'm getting closer to the edge, and the tower's gradually getting taller. So you're starting to see that evolutionary solving sort of take effect. I think it's actually found an even better spot than the corners in this case. It must have found optimal.
And just saying, it's not artificial intelligence. It's just finding the parameters. I really see like some people are saying, oh yeah, this is AI engine. No, it's not AI engine. Is just showing the parameters and comparing them together. So it's learning here. It's more than just comparing results into each other.
Yeah, it's just mathematics by some very smart people.
Yes.
So yeah, we can go down, to the most successful ones, and we can see, okay, what do you look like? Where are you? We can see they're all around the same point. So you can use that to start to identify optimal outcomes. But for me, if we ever do anything generative, we go to Grasshopper. We don't go to the generative design tool in Revit. I think I gave them a sympathy half point because they have a product development team. I'm not sure who the product manager is these days. I know that the first one I think moved on. But I'm not going to hold too many punches with generative design here just because I haven't really seen it do too much yet in the Autodesk sense. But happy for them to jump on and take a few rounds with you and see if they can prove me wrong.
Yeah. But we gave maximum points for Grasshopper since it's really good engines and they are for free. Okay, we have to speed up because we have already passed 2 hours. So let's go to the last round, file sharing and accessibility. I think with this round, we gave different scores for software. So for Grasshopper, we have lots of user interface building systems like plugins, like Simple. It's really good one for creating. We have Synapse. We have human UI, but as Gavin already mentioned, that it's not the best ones. They're kind of clunky, and sometimes you have to create bigger script for creating user interface than just your script yourself. We have this Grasshopper player, which is not that commonly used. It's really nice to create your script, save the definition, and play your definition without opening the Grasshopper. So you can just write in Rhino window, okay, select the wall and just make the height. So it will create, so you can as defined as you want, and you can compile your definition and add it to the package manager. I will give 1 point extra for hops. for Grasshopper. So it's kind of similar way. So you're creating with the same components of Grasshopper player, you save your definition, and then by using hubs, so you can go to the server or just using locally, and it will be used the same. So it's also a great way to use a Rhino server if you don't have your own one. I would like to also mention two really cool plugins. One is called Branch Hopper by Martin Menegold about adding visual version control to Grasshopper. So it allows you to track, manage, and visualize all the changes in Grasshopper, which I think is really nice for the visual programming, and everything is based on the GitHub. So it's the same. So it will support the same concepts as the like branches, commits, and merges. And the same goes for the definition library by Nicholas Burgers. So you can also import, export scripts, take a version control, and share with your colleagues. You have different perspective, right, on the Grasshopper compared to Dynamo, because you gave more points to Dynamo, and I want to know if you can explain more about that.
So it depends on how we approach, I guess, where accessibility begins and ends. So for me, I guess the biggest challenge with any visual programming environment is if you add dependencies or packages into the mix, it can get quite complicated. You need to set up deployment strategies for your organization. There's version control, version management. Sometimes people will just pick up a script and not realize what it needs to run, and maybe it's not in your base distribution of packages. So that's the only reason I'm unsure if having to use custom packages to create accessibility is necessarily the greatest. Like Grasshopper Player is the main one, I guess you mentioned there, and being able to package onto the package manager. But I guess both of them still, like Grasshopper Player has some pretty cool limitations. You still have to have Grasshopper sort of open behind the scenes to run a player, from what I understand, or at least in my experience, unless there's a different way of running it. And I guess when you bundle up to the package manager, you still have to get someone to go and download that and, you know, include it in their particular copy of Grasshopper. So I'm mostly looking at it from the perspective of trying to get something to an end user, but not having to get all this other stuff with it in order for it to work. But I totally appreciate, like, the Grasshopper community and McNeil have done some really cool projects. Like Hops is awesome. So I'm not devaluing that work. I think it's great. It's just that, like, you have to raise the accessibility bar just by a bit to even get to the point of accessibility, which to me is a bit of a conundrum from a scalability point of view. But I guess like Dynamo naturally has its own Dynamo player. And in my opinion, it's definitely better than the Grasshopper player in its interface and how it actually works. It just does a single run. It's built to do a single run. It's a very easy thing for a user to understand what it's doing, how it's working. It gives a little bit more feedback as to what's happened and what's going on. And I think it supports quite a few more input types out of the box, including some drop downs and other types of interface components. So I think that already for me was a big win coming to Dynamo originally, trying to give it to other users in my company. But I guess from there, if we do go down the extensions path, Dynamo similarly has some pretty powerful extensions available to abstract the complexity away from the user, like Dynamo Player. So Orchestra is a really well-known add-in for Revit effectively, and I think it's also a web platform that essentially bundles up your scripts and distributes them out to your company through the cloud, and automatically loads packages that it needs on the fly. So it's like a just-in-time sort of system, and it lets you package these up into toolbars natively in your program as well. So from a UI UX perspective, they're quite powerful. As well as this, there's other sort of lighter add-ins that you can use if you're a smaller company, and a lot of them are free or partially free, like Nonica. Relay is completely open source, and they let you bundle your scripts behind an interface that's fairly engageable and distributable for an end user. And I guess ultimately, I'm always biased with accessibility because my end game is to get down to like plugins and things that are very controllable from a UI UX perspective. But if we're just looking at Dynamo and Grasshopper, I think they both have benefits. But to me, in my experience, it's much harder to make Grasshopper accessible unless you have like a really willing IT department, which luckily I do. But I appreciate like the majority of AEC firms are like, 30 to 50 people or lower. And at that point, you're lucky to get like any sort of IT support that's in-house or that can even understand what you're trying to do in the first place with distributing all this stuff around the company, respecting security, all those sorts of things that come into play when you're running a firm. So for me, that's where it gets a bit challenging from the Grasshopper side. So hopefully that sort of outlines my rationale, but happy to duke it out.
Yeah, like in this round, Gavin gave 2 points and 1 point Grasshopper. For me, for this one was 1-1. I think they are both strong, and it's a draw. But you can also, as always, you can just write some of your thoughts. Some wall just wrote Dynamo player, even natively, can also have a Stargate running setup. Collect the data, adjust the input, switch to toggle to true, and run to the end.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind the idea of 1-1. It's not like I'm not completely opposed to the sentiment, because like the Dynamo is not 100% accessible. There's barriers, there's challenges. So like it's not like perfect. So I don't. If you include all the plugins and the add-ins, like maybe 1-1 could be seen as a fair assessment, given that they have their own challenges. Like one relies on more plugins to do it, the other one has a lower ceiling, I guess, in terms of the UI UX. So I'm flexible on that one. I'm not completely opposed to your opinion.
Yeah. All right, we went through all the 10 rounds. Let's go to summary, but just before we will jump to the summary, I would like to mention about my training. So will Gavin come back in just 2 minutes. Someone already asked about if there is any trainings on my platform. So from Ben, Kris, do you have any courses, Rhino, Grasshopper? So I would like to say that in 2 weeks, we are opening Grasshopper in Revit training. This is advanced training that we are specifically focus on how to use Rhino inside Revit. However, we are going to combine this with package with Grasshopper fundamentals. So this training will be based also for or starting with Grasshopper from zero. So we what our aim was with making this training was to make Revit enjoyable again and automate frustrating manual tasks with Grasshopper. So what we are teaching in this training, so first of all, auto-generate views, sheets, tags, and dimensions for clean, consistent documentation. This is where Grasshopper is really good, Dynamo as well, but we have this debate which to use to which task. We can edit parameters, of course, with Grasshopper as well across many elements to keep schedules accurate. We can also, with Grasshopper, load and place families in one go, so you can roll out all the hundreds of doors, walls, windows in seconds with Grasshopper, and which we also proved about cross integration with different software. Grasshopper is very powerful, so we are also going to integrate that in our training to show you how to connect with analysis software, all the other BIM software. As Adam mentioned, no pro coding skills required. Someone asked about if you have to know Dynamo to learn Grasshopper. Knowledge of Dynamo will be really helpful. We have lots of students starting with Grasshopper, so it's easier to understand all the concepts, but we start from zero. So we are starting in 2 weeks. So it's an online training, self-paced training that sets you free from the endless manual clicks in Revit. We focus on practice, so 80% practice and 20% of theory. So we have lots of practical case studies in Revit from real Revit projects, and I think this is our advantage. We have also closed Grasshopper in Revit community for brainstorming, for checking results, checking the exercises, and just ask students and all the instructor for the help. And is conducted by me and Jungfu that I presented earlier. So we have both experience in using Grasshopper, together 25 years of experience. I'm an engineer, Jungfu is an architect, so I think this is the best mix to present the tool. So who is this training for? We focused on general perspective for using Grasshopper in Revit. So this training is for structural engineers, architects, BIM coordinators, map designers, bridge designers, drafters, basically for anyone who would like to start with Grasshopper in Revit. Is particularly focused on AEC industry, so we can find examples for BIM collisions, buildings, stadiums, bridges as well. So for those interested, we are really invite you to sign up for the waiting list. You can just sign up for Grasshopper in Revit.com, so you will get the best offer in 2 weeks. And we are going to open that this training on our next workshop. So I would like to invite you already for Fix Revit Top Panes in 6 steps with Grasshopper, where I will invite Jungfu Park for the next workshop, and we're going to show you some cool practical application of Grasshopper. All right, so that was a little bit advertisement. Let's go to our results. So this is the whole list of Dynamo versus Grasshopper. Are you happy with the results, Gavin, or what was your thoughts? 11 to 15.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I feel like we generally formed a really good consensus on where we felt each stands, and I think the result does reflect that Grasshopper is generally like quite an applicable program to a lot of scenarios. It's very versatile. So I sort of went into this not expecting to have Dynamo with the most points because it is much more specific in its application. And like I said, I love using Grasshopper, so like I didn't really mind which one won per se, because like I win either way. I'm using both, but I encourage anyone here that's a Dynamo or a Grasshopper user to try out both, because you're always just better off having more options, at least in your mind, so you can identify the right time to use the right tool on the right project for the right reason. But yeah, like if you're a Dynamo user and you've never touched Grasshopper, like look at the points. Like it's a versatile platform. You should be at least trying it, and Rhino inside Revit is certainly worth your attention as well. I would enforce that some of these criteria would be weighted differently for different types of people or different disciplines, different companies. So like if you're a heavy Revit user, like obviously Revit data handling is a much bigger round for you. So we didn't really weight them against types of people. That's like another way we could frame these results and see how they balance depending on types of roles or backgrounds. But ultimately, I think if we had to be fair, distribute the points generally, like I'm happy with where we ended up, and I congratulate Grasshopper on being a fantastic program. Yeah.
And I would like to also bring out one of the good comments from Yud. One gets you the job, the other gets you job done. And you can put which software made which task, but I'm pretty sure that all of you get then a really clear overview. I will just point the same what Gavin said at the bottom line. Choose tool correct to the specific workflow. Two tools are great to use for different tasks, but every time answering the question, I always start with the software that your colleagues are using at work. I think this is also the tip that being alone and working on yourself, it's the biggest nightmares of coming into programming. And using, if your colleagues are Dynamo and you get guest support, so go for that. If you have any colleagues that you can help you with Grasshopper, so for sure it's your first choice. So just write in the comments what is your choice right now. Maybe some of you change your mind. Maybe we have some Dynamo users who are really interested to learn Dynamos. I'm really encourage you to join Learn Grasshopper platform, and the same other stuff. If you feel like the data handling in Revit is the task that you are doing every day, so I really recommend checking Gavin website for the training. He did exceptionally great work for doing this training, so for sure it's a good investment learning Dynamo as well. We have some questions from the audience. Gavin, do you still have time to answer some of the questions?
Yeah, there's some really interesting ones that I saw go past, so I'd love to be able to address them. Yeah.
Let's jump to them. First one. Let me see. What do you think will come about ahead when it comes to integrating with artificial intelligence? There are many examples involving Dynamo, but I'm not sure if there's anything comparable for Grasshopper. And I can just start. Maybe you can add something more, Gavin. That this is also two different softwares. Like Autodesk is not. Sorry, Rhinoceros is privately owned, so they do not depend on the investors. Autodesk has to jump on this AI train, and they have to show every year that they are going to integrate. As I see, Rhinoceros, McNeil is not investing in the AI. There are lots of plugins, actually, Raven, Brain, there's few of them, so you can use the power of AI inside Grasshopper, but they are not from officially side from McNeil. And I really understand. Autodesk, to please all the investors, they have to say that they are using AI tools. I don't know if they are useful. Have seen some examples. Maybe Gavin, you've been testing out something.
Well, there hasn't really been much we can test from them yet. It's still coming. I would definitely recommend people watch the AU keynote and watch the use cases that Autodesk chooses to show, and use that to judge if you think that AI for Revit's going to be useful from their side. I won't say exactly.
Can you spoiler? Can you spoiler? What was that about, or should we check this out?
They chose to change the size of some windows based on window wall ratio, and they had to spell out the family name down to the character to get it to understand it. I think there was something where it highlighted some elements based on a property, and I think it counted some elements. Are they tasks where AI is needed? I'm not sure. Like, it seemed like they were still very preliminary in scope. But I guess like that was a clear indication. If that's what Autodesk wants to show us, that's where it's going. That's not necessarily the limit of what they can do right now, but you think they'd want to show like the best use cases they've got, because you're going to impress the shareholders, right? Like, as you said, when you've got shareholders, you want to show the best thing you can do, right? Otherwise, unless it's like an ace in the hole and you don't want to give it away yet, but I don't think there would have been a lot of risk in showing the best things they can do. So I think with Grasshopper and Dynamo generally, it depends on what you expect AI to do. So there's like really only a few ways that I think you can integrate AI in those types of visual environments. One is that it just sits there as a processor. It's just doing a data-based workflow where you prompt something out. It hopefully gives you something structured enough back that you can pull the necessary parameters out of what you get in order to create an outcome in the model, because you're going to have to get some key values, parameters, things that you can turn into an algorithm. Not just a bunch of text that does nothing. Otherwise, you can put a watch node in Dynamo and say, there's your response, and you've just got like an AI chatbot in Dynamo. You could just do it in ChatGPT as well. Like, it doesn't make a difference. It's just a different place, putting the same thing in a different place. I've seen some Grasshopper attempts at constructing scripts based on AI. The results are pretty mixed. It doesn't tend to create very complex scripts, but it does seem like there are some, like I've seen a few like automatically created twisted tower scripts from AI, but I'm like, that's the most available script on the internet, which AI is generally trained on, so no wonder it can build it. Good luck figuring out how to put like a Zaha Hadid level script together, because they're not putting that on the internet. Like, so it's an interesting one. I think I encourage any firm that really wants to get into AI to expect that they're going to have to bring in their own private implementations of AI, their own learning sets and data to inform their routines and really determine what they want AI to do. Like, don't just expect it to do everything. It's better when you find specific use cases. We're using a little bit in-house at Architect this, but we made sure that we thought about what we really wanted to get out of it before we applied it, because otherwise you're just shooting into the air and hoping the bullet doesn't come and land on your head because you didn't know where you were aiming anyway. So it's a bit pointless unless you go in knowing what you want. Yeah.
And as Fabio mentioned, sometimes you have to be careful. Sometimes things sold as AI are just hidden Galapagos under And AI is really great for writing your Python and C# scripts. It's just amazing. However, there are some tries already to make this into visual programming. So actually, you can make a print screen of your Grasshopper or Dynamo script, and actually it can change it to Python and C#. So there's lots of things going on. So we'll see.
Yeah,
What's
it's a
the
good
best?
we move on. I've actually used BIM Logic and seen how it works. It's an interesting one. So it's sort of, it feels a bit like Dynamo's intent with Dynamo Player. So the way it works is it goes and writes some code for you in C#. It's an MCP-based approach, so Model Context Protocol. And in this case, it basically assembles you like a mini add-in in principle that it can run. But the cool thing about it that I've seen is they're trying to make it so you can package them up as like little Dynamo Player scripts, and you can share these prompts around the business with the code behind it. The only thing I'm not sure about with MCP is whether you're going to get consistent results depending on the types of models you run in. That's where I think MCP struggles at the moment. It makes a lot of assumptions to be able to get a functional piece of code by the end of this thing, because, you know, some things are really hard to code, and I don't think MCP is at the point where it can just make a full algorithm that, you know, is complex. So, but I think BIM Logic is probably the best one I've seen so far in Revit. So do check it out if you're interested in MCP and Revit for sure. Yeah.
Good to see Jaffe from McNeil here with us. The real winner here is the users. Thank for all of you guys for the community. So yeah, good to see you.
It's great to see the developers of these programs present in these types of events. And I will admit, like, McNeil does a really good job of socially supporting their community. So thank you to anyone from McNeil here for what you do. We feel it as users of your software. Like, you're a really great bunch. Yeah.
What is the best software to facade design and fabrication? We tried to already answer that question. I see that Grasshopper and Rhino is commonly used for facade, especially for the complex shapes, but still exported results into Revit. Do you have also Dynamo experience with facade, Gavin?
A little bit. Generally, double curvatures get a little bit frustrating in Dynamo. In my experience, you have to construct lofts and, you know, rationalize them in more messy ways. Like, Dynamo isn't generally like as intuitive as Grasshopper in placing control geometry natively to then use as a lofting definition. Often you have to like write a lot of the geometry into the script, which is, you know, to me quite annoying. Facade design's a funny one. It depends on the types of facades you're designing. Like, if you're doing very modular facades and you're more focused on a kit of parts that you're trying to rationalize your design down to, then Grasshopper or even Revit on its own could get the job done, with Dynamo helping for like set out dimensions and criteria. If you're doing like a Frank Gehry style facade, like, you might need something like Katia, or like, you know, something really bespoke. Like, you know, Gehry, I think they still use Katia from what I understand for a lot of their work, and then Revit's really just how they put their drawings together. But a lot of the work happens outside Revit and outside Rhino. So it just really depends on the types of facades you're doing. And I think you've just got to experiment with the programs. Yeah.
And I've been following some companies that are also using Tekla and Tekla LiveLink with Grasshopper. And this is also like one of the advantages of Grasshopper, that you're investing in learning Grasshopper, but you can reuse that in different software. So if you're changing your company and he's using, for example, different tools, so if you know Grasshopper, so for sure you still can use your skill set. When Grasshopper will be available for Civil 3D, this is not, I'm not sure. I know that there have been some plugins for using, for example, Grasshopper in AutoCAD. I know that some people are using that, but never heard about Civil 3D. But I think it's a niche here. I think it will be great usage for the infrastructure projects when you have to follow all these clotoids, all the curvatures. So I think it's a niche to develop this Civil 3D. So if you have any developers and Civil 3D users, feel free to reach out. Maybe there is lots of possibilities to do something. Is there a way to obtain skilled certification similar to Revit specialist, but for Grasshopper instead? For Grasshopper, McNeil has a certification program for Rhino. So you get level 1 and level 2. And I have been happy to also introduce that there will be a similar Grasshopper certification that I have pleasure to work on that. And it will be available in a couple of months as far as I know. So I've been helping for creating all the questions. So the certification program will be available for McNeil. For now, I'm really invite you for the learngrasshopper.com, where I build my trainings, and so it will be easier for you to pass this certificate. Do you think Speckle will make a difference here in our industry? I can start. Definitely, I had a workshop with Speckle, just showing integration with different software, showing Speckle intelligence, how you can actually make cool graphs and data analysis, and showing the way that you don't have to send your files, like IFC files or DVG files. You can just send data, and this is kind of BIM to zero.
Yeah, my recommendation to make Speckle work, and this is how I've enjoyed trying it in the past, is find a project where you're working with someone else and they're using a different program that happens to work with Speckle, and just see what you can do with it. See what you can send back and forth to each other. It's a really fun way to learn Speckle, because you'll be working with someone that doesn't see what you're trying to do the same way you do, but like Speckle can be a really interesting way to bring things together and also get them back down into your environment. You can start to learn about interoperabilities that you probably wouldn't have had available anywhere else before. The Speckle team is really cool. Like, they're really invested, really passionate. They're sort of like, feels to me like if Flux kept going, they would have just become Speckle eventually. Like, it feels like the natural progression where they're like, why do we just want to hook two platforms together? Let's put them all together, like, and, you know, make it like Git and make it really logical. So just try it out. Try to find someone else that wants to try it with you. And it's not just some person next to you working in the same type of model as you. And that's like the best way to see if it makes a difference. Yeah.
Let me see if there's, of course, Grasshopper is the winner. The name is not shiny, but it's best for sure. Yeah, Dynamo. I really like the Dynamo name.
It's funny though, because if you try to find Dynamo on Google and you're not specific enough, you end up getting the magician, or you get the laundry powder. We always joke in the Dynamo community that we're just like the laundry powder like product or whatever.
Just every time I'm just writing Grasshopper without 3D going, so animal. The same with Rhino. What level of Revit knowledge is expected for Grasshopper in Revit training? So we have both trainings. We have Grasshopper Fundamentals, which is not any knowledge is required. It's just we are teach you both Grasshopper and Rhino. And for Grasshopper in Revit, so it's just a basic level of Revit is necessary. So you don't have to be expert in Revit to start with this training. Let me see, there is some, if you've seen some of the questions. I'm wondering, conclusion for complex Revit automation, Dynamo is slightly usable than Grasshopper. In any other automation, Rhino is a champion. No, I think it's too simply to explain, but yeah, it can, in a way, it can be explained.
I guess I'll back that up a little bit in saying that Rhino and Grasshopper are much more powerful than I think people realize until they use them. There is a bit of a like conception in the Australian market in particular that it's like for students and graduates and universities, because that's where McNeil's done like a lot of work. So often it's seen as like a, you know, a graduate toy by some companies. They're like, oh, just get in Revit. Like, you know, what are you doing in Rhino? And it's like, you know, we don't want Rhino licenses. And like, they definitely underestimate the value that you can pull out of the tool. And I think one of the reasons is because Rhino and Grasshopper on their own, it's not like apparent what you're meant to do with them. Like, they're a very flexible tool. So it's up to you as the company to build systems that do what you want them to do, or to research what other people have done with the platform. It's not like Revit where you have a wall tool and a room tool, and it's basically just giving you like a really restrictive but functional set of tools. It's like, we've built you a tool that builds tools. So like, you know, go nuts. So that's sort of, I will admit, like, Rhino is underestimated too often. So I'll back you up on that, at least. I know. Yeah.
Christian, who shared this example with the solar analysis. A good question, actually. Are there still any areas where Dynamo excels compared to Rhino inside? If you are already using Rhino inside and familiar with the interface and workflow, so is there any arguments for people who are using Grasshopper to start with Dynamo?
a few. I mean, I guess I would put the challenge to you, Christian. You might be using Rhino Inside, but are you working with other people at distributing your tools to other people using Rhino Inside? That's when it gets a bit more challenging. That's when you have to bring other people on board that aren't just Revit users. They're like comfortable with Grasshopper, and maybe you are, which is like awesome if you are. Like, not having a go at you if you're doing that, but that's the question I think you probably have to ask to yourself eventually, because you're probably great at using it personally, I imagine, regardless of whether you're supporting other users. But if you're not supporting other users, you might find that's where it gets a bit harder. And that's where I found it was harder. Like the first time I told someone to launch a script in Rhino Inside, I could tell they were worried. They were like, I'm going to crash my model. I'm going to lose work. I'm going to lose time. So you need that confidence level as a user to feel comfortable with that. But on top of that, there's two key limitations I found. I don't think Grasshopper has a native Excel reader still as a node. And that can be quite useful in Revit to be able to work with that type of data. There's native JSON support in Dynamo as well, whereas I think in Grasshopper you need JSON or something like it. So, or you need to resort to Python pretty quickly to make up for some of the gaps in the coverage of nodes in Rhino Inside. I think Rhino Inside naturally, it provides a lot of nodes, but it's still focused on knowing that you're probably going to be dealing with a decent amount of geometry because you're coming to Rhino Inside from Revit to probably work with that as one of your core motivators. So there's not as many data-focused nodes as there would be in Dynamo. So it just depends on how comfortable you are in writing in Python, distributing Python, or making a package that interfaces with Revit and Rhino through Rhino Inside, which is quite complex but possible. That they're probably the key limitations, I guess, that I would challenge the notion on.
Yeah, I would like to also follow on this comment. Also highly recommended the Gavin Dynamo course. I purchased it for training my colleagues up in Dynamo, and it's fantastic. So already have one person actively developing now. So I can also join this comment, recommend checking Gavin Nicholls, Aussie BIM Guru, for check the trainings. Okay, cool. I think we have still some questions, but I know that it's really late in Australia right now, so I will not take more of your time. I really invite you for the next workshop. I really sure that it will interest you as well. So this one will be in 2 weeks, fix Revit top panes in 6 steps with Grasshopper. So we are going to talk about how to automate drawing creation, sheets, dimensions, tags, also how to bulk edit all the parameters, how to create complex geometries with Grasshopper in Revit. So I really recommend that one. We got lots of good questions. Saying thanks for all your work. Thank you. That was a really cool battle. Some people we saying that Grasshopper is totally winner, but there are a few good points for Dynamo. So really thank you, Gavin, for this interesting conversation. And yeah, maybe next time we're going to make something similar for C# and Python. You've been showing on your channel a lot of great stuff when it comes to C#. Are you going to continue this series?
Yeah, when I get time. I've sort of run out of time for YouTube. I'm still developing C# toolbars where I work like every day. So my knowledge is still growing in that space, and there's much more I can bring back to the channel on the back of that. I just literally, my life has just enveloped too much of my time for the next few months at least. There might be a few collaboration videos coming to the channel, but like series wise, I'm probably going to need to come back next year to it. So if anyone is waiting for me, don't hold your breath. But I guess in the meantime, feel free to contact me through LinkedIn or at aussiebimguru@gmail.com. Always happy to take questions. If there's any questions we didn't get to, drop me a line. More than happy to follow up with you as well. But I guess I'd like to thank you, Kris, for the work you're doing, but also for inviting me on, and also for conducting a very civilized debate. Like, it's very easy to come into these types of versus topics and be very aggressive and, very unprofessional, like a lot of people get like when you attack the software they like. And I think you provided a very great debate space, but also like a really constructive environment where we can ultimately learn from each other, but also teach more people what's possible. So and I look forward to seeing your platforms grow, and keep up the great work as well.
Thank you. Thank you. You can stay on the line. And thank you very much. I'm going to send all the materials that we presented tomorrow in the morning. So again, have a good night, Gavin.
Thanks. See everyone.
Nice.